Blacksmith of the Apocalypse. By Arcuser. Chapter 701 Beemant. Unreconciled soul. Beemant, big, unique. The soul of Beemant, a high-ranking member of the Adventurer Guild. He had many plans in life and is not ready to move on. Hovering above a mutilated corpse stuck half in the wall, was a soul with a slightly humanoid shape. It looked like a genie version of Beemant. If this wasn't lucky, then what was? It seemed like Beemant was the only one that managed to put up a fight and died with regrets. Ding! A new quest has been generated. Quest: Reconcile Beemant. Find the culprit who wiped out the Adventurer Guild's team and avenge their unfair deaths. Quest rewards: 1 Beemant's reconciled soul. 2 Information on the hidden vault of the Adventurer Guild. Would you like to accept the quest? Y/N. Seth was stumped for a moment. It had been a long time since he had gotten one of these quests. However, the blacksmith pressed no without any hesitation. He didn't know what Beemant's reconciled soul could do, but he didn't want it. This was not a game, and he had no interest to waste time in having to look for and fight someone that was probably really strong. Especially not when he had a better way. As mentioned, this was not a game. In a complex world like Earth, it was to be expected that there were more possibilities to get what he wanted. He expected Beemant's unreconciled soul to react aggressively if it saw him, but he was absolutely undetectable, so he could simply walk up to it. The moment he grabbed it, it was already too late for it to even try and resist. Using the seed of Hades, he unceremoniously shoved the screeching soul down into the rotting chest cavity of Beemant's corpse. He did this in a quick, decisive move because he was really disgusted by the sweet stench of rot and the sight of the corpse. It was a struggle between his curiosity and greed and his aversion to the smelly stuff that the former barely won. Seth's skin crawled as he watched the corpse reverse rot. The skill's power took a little longer than with a fresh kill, which gave the blacksmith ample time to watch the horrifying and fascinating process. It was hard to look away from it. In the end, there was a perfectly fine Beemant, touching his healed-up chest in wonder, through the hole in his completely destroyed armor and clothes. Seth switched back to RoyalRoad, allowing Beemant to see him. How is this possible? Master. The last word came like a delayed reflex upon seeing Seth, which made the adventurer wonder why he added it. Was Beemant strong enough to resist some of the effects of the skill? Seth was a little suspicious. Had the adventurer really been that strong, or was it maybe a special skill or attribute? Although he was now listed as a vassal, he didn't quite act like a brainwashed slave, like the Leave 95 boss did. It's one of my skills. I can revive someone as my vassal, Seth explained, although it was apparent from the look in Beemant's eyes, that the realization of what had happened had kicked in with him calling Seth Master. I understand, Master. Seth sighed, seeing him struggle with the title. Just call me Tower Master then, if Master is too hard. You are now part of Minasmar, whether you like it or not. As you wish, Tower Master, he said with significantly less trouble. Good, tell me what happened here. Beemant described to him that several days after the departure of the teams, an adventurer was revived in the Stronghold's return room. It was not unexpected for someone to die in the dungeons of the Holy Land, which was the whole reason why they had a temporary branch set up here. But in the night after his arrival, Beemant was unable to sleep. His instinct told him that something was not right. When he went to check on the state of the castle, he found the guard killed and the members murdered in their beds. When he finally surprised the culprit, it was the adventurer that had returned just the day before. Somehow he had gained incredible strength. The adventurer leader fought him, to allow the last survivors of his subordinate to flee, as home call failed to work. I suspect he is a chosen of some evil god, that allows him to absorb part of the power of his victims. I see, so the guild was not behind home call not working. It was Seth's turn to summarize all the weird happenstances that happened to Minasmar and the other guilds. Do you think it was this rogue champion? I don't know. All of this is too unusual and chaotic. I can only guarantee you that the guild really had no hidden intentions, Tower Master, Beemant assured. Aside from revealing a new threat and clearing the Adventurer Guild's name, Beemant was not really useful for now. Don't forget to ask him for treasure, Mom, Tatzel hurriedly reminded him. Thanks for the reminder, Tatzel. I was going to ask that next, he thanked the greedy pseudo-dragon. Right, there was something more. Since the quest mentioned it, it was certain that a hidden vault existed in this place. Seth had no intention to let that one go. Although Beemant was reluctant, his loyalty to the Adventurer Guild was now something of his past life. As the former leader of the castle, he obviously knew where the hidden vault was and had the authority to open it. The tall adventurer led the blacksmith to the cellar of the castle. This place still looked much more intact than the castle above. Seth followed him into a room full of big wine barrels, all of them were smashed at this point. Had somebody already come here looking for something? Don't worry, this is the setup. Who would keep looking in a place where all options for a hidden lever or room have already been smashed, right? While saying so, Beemant went over to one of the support beams of the cellar and pulled out one of the big, crude iron nails. He then proceeded to stick his finger into the hole left by the nail. It glowed and a magic formation quickly started engraving itself with bright sparks on the cellar wall. Within mere moments, a round vault door took shape and Beemant started inputting 3 different combinations. They really didn't joke about the safety. At least he didn't need 2 keys or something before being able to open it. Contrary to the big show, the contents of the vault were disappointing, at least to Seth. There were no expensive metals or rare monster parts in the vault. The room behind the vault door wasn't too big and most of it was taken up by the materials they had already imported to build the teleport hub. These materials were mostly very rare and special stones that were needed to not just create a permanent beacon, but also connect to the pathworks. There were also stones that were needed to connect the structure to the dragon veins of the land as a power source. All of these very expensive materials, but absolutely nothing Seth was interested in. He wasn't a mason or architect after all. Well, since we did this, let's pack up. Get into the ring, Beemant, and explain stuff to the guys inside while I get out of here, Seth said, slightly dispirited. What do you mean it's empty? He barked at the communication crystal. The creature at the other end of the line winced. Myanmar's departure did not stay unnoticed for as long as Seth may have hoped. A humanoid patchwork of body parts was currently standing in the empty halls of the abandoned camp. Myanmar had not really bothered to fully repair the defenses after making the decision to leave. Without any guard stopping it, the poorly mended fortification could not stop the creature who specialized in infiltration for long. Realizing that the materials had managed to run after all his efforts and investments into this venture frustrated the demon, and he called his collaborator. A man with his face crusted in dried blood answered his call. Didn't you say they would be unable to escape as long as I block spatial escape routes? Where are you? He asked for an explanation after telling him about the abandoned stronghold. I didn't expect for them to make a break for it this quickly. You also didn't expect that they would resist my babies. Not only did I lose a lot of my subjects, but I also didn't even get anything in return. What are you even good for? The demon ranted. Don't talk to me like that, you vermin. It seems I have been too nice to you. You are lucky that there is no worth for me in killing you, the adventurer barked back incited. Both stared at each other with hatred in their eyes, before the adventurer finally sighed. I will see if I can intercept them at the entrance valley. What makes you think they would be there? They could pass the rim storm at any place. Yes, they could. But it is our only lead. If they look for answers from the guild or try to find out what happened, that would be the only place to look for it. If they don't, there is no stopping them, is there? Chapter 702. Vivi segmentation. Ah, but you can't store this in your inventory or this ring, Tower Master, Beemant said hurriedly. Affirmed. Target cannot be stored, Legion affirmed Beemant's statement. Why not? It's because of the nature of these materials, Beemant started his explanation. Of course, he was not a wizard, so the explanation was not very technical. The crux of the matter was that these materials had a lot of traits that interfered with and stabilized space. This was the reason why they were needed to create a teleport hub, and the same reason why they messed with spatial storage. For that reason, the Adventurer Guild had to bring them here the ordinary way. They had been brought here with a carriage, just like the adventurers. What this ultimately meant was that Seth couldn't just pack them up and take them along. But he also couldn't leave them here. Even if they closed the vault, at least the Adventurer Guild knew about it, and if they came back before them, they would obviously keep their materials. Fine, then I will just store them in the same place as the beacon. Although Seth had thought about setting up a teleport hub at Agra Mountain or maybe along the tree route using these materials, it wasn't really that important to him. He could just leave them here and they would build their own teleport hub in the Holy Land sometime in the future. Accompanied by Beemant, Seth set off to find a place to set up the temporary spatial beacon and store the materials for later use. Since the revelation of treasures had bummed him out, Seth was not in the mood to look for long to find the right place. The blacksmith found a tight crevasse, just wide enough for him to squeeze through, and judged it good. Swinging the pickaxe with practiced moves, Seth simply created the perfect place to set the temporary beacon with his mining skill. While he started on the place to store everything, he sent Beemant and some of the Golem Knights to retrieve the materials. In the crevasse, Seth dug a similarly tight tunnel deep into the rock of the mountains, before widening it into a chamber. The rubble of this work appeared in Legion for later use. Once it reached roughly the size of a shack, Seth brought out Evie to take a look and set up the beacon herself. Following her instruction, he modified the room a little further. In the meantime, the Immortal Witch set up her beacon and the corresponding formations. It was different from the time when Seth simply cut a rough formation into the stone, following Al's instructions. Evie drew a much more complicated magic circle on the floor using a special chalk, that turned into a thin layer of crystal when she finished it with a spell. According to her, the portal they opened using this beacon and formation, would be much more stable and predictable than the makeshift solution Seth experienced the first time. Before Evie returned to Legion, the golems and Beemant had already returned with the materials. Beemant? What is he doing here? Why is he with the Golem Knights? I wanted to leave the explanation for when we were out of this place. Seth said with a sigh and started giving Evie a summary of what had happened. Can I leave explaining it to the others to you? Fine, I will make sure the guild guys don't rip Beemant apart before he gets a chance to talk. The Immortal Witch had aptly read his intentions and agreed to make sure there were no unfortunate circumstances before they returned to Delta. With that, Evie and Beemant both entered Legion, while the golems started bringing in the chests and boxes of materials. One by one they squeezed through the tight entrance and tunnel. Since there were not too many, it didn't take long to cut a groove into the wall of the tunnel and store them inside. With everything set in place, Seth started filling up the tunnel and crevasse with the rubble from his mining. Having the tight natural crevasse at the front and everything filled in with rocks, there was little chance anyone would find the place easily. Stepping outside, Seth switched back to the helm of Hades and turned to return the golems to Legion. Where do you little birdies think you are going? A screech echoed through the valley. Before Seth could store the golems, one of the Golem Knights suddenly had a hole punched through his chest from behind. A shard hand was sticking out from its breastplate. At the end of the arm, Seth saw a man covered in dried blood. His eyes widened in surprise, ripped open from shock when he saw the man's status with Aya's discerning eyes. The man was a monster. Dragos Cernat Leave 97. Name, Dragos Cernat. Title, Chosen of Amit. Level, 97. Blessing. Age, 23. Class, Agent of Gluttony. Race, Orihuma. With almost all his attributes above 600, he was even above Seth in his full loadout, rivaling the base strength of the better Golem Knights. But this was not the most shocking thing. The man's list of skills was so long that Seth didn't even have time to scroll to the end, much less read any of them before things progressed. What is this empty thing? Dragos exclaimed, pulling his arm out of the unfazed golem and evading the golem counter-strike. He evaded the golem's attack and with an overwhelming kick, he folded the walking armor like a piece of paper. The Golem Knight in question was catapulted into the mountainside where it was buried in broken rocks. But when Dragos turned to the other figures he had seen, they were already gone. Seth had sneakily packed them away and decided to observe the man. Combing through his list of skills while he was struggling with the golem. There were a lot of magic skills, but it didn't seem like the man in question was trained to use them in battle. He was mostly fighting using a mix of hand-to-hand combat and weaponless martial arts. But this was enough to make the golem struggle like a helpless rag doll thanks to his tremendous stats further buffed by many passive skills. Passive skill, Heart Eater Leave 9. A fraction of the power of the great goddess Amit. By eating the heart of another player, you sacrifice his power to the goddess, in exchange you are blessed with part of this power yourself. Based on the enemy's powers, high chance to gain AP. Medium chance to gain stat improvements. Low chance to steal one of their skills. Just how many people had that maniac killed to gain so many skills? More importantly, could he keep this guy alive? At this point, it was quite obvious that he was the one behind the attack on the Adventurer Guild and probably even more people. I heard of these things, so I was right that you would take this route. You are the guys from Minas Mar, right? You have to be hiding somewhere around here, right? He cried out with a crazed look, after ripping the Golem Knight apart. This guy had not hesitated for even a moment to attack, like some beast. His existence alone already posed a great danger. But this sentence sealed Seth's decision. He had decided not to kill lightly, but this guy was something else. In a quick, decisive strike, the blacksmith swung the ravenous sog to take the man's head. After his battle with the ethnarch, the sword had grown to become one of his strongest weapons. Wishing to end it in one strike, he could only trust in this blade. Against his expectations, Dragos seemed to instinctively sense the danger of the blade aiming for his nape, turned around, and blocked the ravenous sog at the cost of his left arm. In the exact same movement, he automatically took a stance and rammed his hand into the chest of the invisible attacker. Blood splattered everywhere, but it was only his blood that soaked the ground. Not only had his left forearm fallen to the earth, his right hand was crushed to a pulp like a chicken that was shot into a concrete wall with a cannon. It was completely unusable but already showed signs of healing. The same could be said for the stump of his left arm, which barely stopped bleeding but didn't show signs of regenerating the limb. Seth on the other hand was shocked that the man had managed to react, despite being under the influence of the Helm of Hades. At least Seth could trust his armor, which easily blocked and reflected the monstrous man's strike. The blacksmith had barely felt the impact. The bard was quicker to overcome his shock and hacked away at the man, who managed to stay alive by evading and at the cost of some more parts of his arms and legs. Even using sight of the eye, Seth was unable to finish him cleanly. It was clear that the man's overall combat power was above his. Yet, it was the man who grit his teeth and turned around to flee into the Holy Land. Seth was ready to pursue him. There was no way he could escape Seth if he changed his helmet to raw egg. However, the man used a magic similar to the one the hive used to flee and vanished before his eyes. All that was left of the man were cut off toes, fingers, a hand, and slices of his forearms. Slightly frustrated that Dragos got away, Seth collected all of them in a box he stored in his inventory. Although it was a little disgusting, these things might come in handy when making preparations for the future. Seth looked back at the massive canyon one last time. Although they had managed to accomplish what they had set out to do, they had barely scratched the surface of this place. If it wasn't for the fact that he didn't like playing into someone else's hands, they may have stayed a little longer. With a big sigh and the resolution to return, the blacksmith finally left the Holy Land, traversed the border storm, and was finally able to use home call outside to return to Delta. Chapter 703 Returning to Delta. It was late evening and the last rays of a setting sun fell through the windows of Delta's system church. Just like the streets outside, the inside of the church was oddly quiet and empty. So much so that the staff was even dozing off. The clerk in charge of the teleport formation was propping his face on his hand. He almost slipped off in surprise and hit his chin on the table when it lit up without warning. The man looked up to greet the rare visitor, but he couldn't see anyone appear inside. As he started suspecting whether it was a malfunction or not, a tall knight in a dark, intricate armor phased into existence, almost giving him a heart attack. Seth had the funny thought of simply smuggling everyone into Delta, so nobody immediately knew they returned, but he decided against it. It didn't seem like the weird disease had spread all the way to the Holy Land, but it was better when they all had witnesses that they were disinfected as they returned from outside. Personally, the blacksmith didn't care about public sentiment, but if the members of the guilds with him had already lost enough, if they even lost their last bit of credibility for threatening the citizen by smuggling past the disinfection measurement in place, they may have held a grudge against him. Although this also really touched him, it did not cost him anything to have everyone go through the proper measures. "Where is Simon?" he asked the surprised clerk. The head priest? Could you be the master of Minas Mar?" The head priest? Was Simon promoted while he was gone? It had barely been a month. "I am. Why? I will go call him." "Please wait for a moment." With that the clerk sprinted out of the room, leaving Seth behind. He didn't have to wait long. Soon he heard the quick and heavy steps of the sprinting, rotund priest. His head was bright red like his robe. He was sweating and gasping. It was obvious he started running the moment he heard Seth had returned. "Seth, you are finally back." "Hey, Simon. You really didn't have to hurry that much. Can you send him away?" The blacksmith wanted to bring out the guild people from Legion, that way he could return to Minas Mar at any time. However, he didn't want to reveal Legion's existence to just anyone, if not necessary, so he asked Simon to send the clerk away. "Who are these people, Seth?" "Wait, isn't that the guild leader of the Boulder Guild? They are the remains of the guilds of Delta that set off to the Holy Land." "Remains? Yeah, a lot of stuff happened over there." Seth was sure these guys also wanted nothing more than to return home. "Then, please walk through the cleansing membrane, but wait at the lobby. The curfew has already started and it's not a good idea to get on the street right now." We will prepare a room for you to stay the night, Simon explained. A curfew? What is that about? Some of them exclaimed. The blacksmith was also surprised. A curfew was something unheard of to modern Earth hands. Restricting someone from leaving their house after a specific time was some medieval practice they had never experienced outside of fiction. I guess there is a lot to explain, Simon said belatedly. Come to my office, I will explain everything thoroughly. Since not everyone fit in the priest's office, the crowd was ushered to their rooms, while only their representatives, Jin, Brock, and Seth were in the priest's office to listen to the priest's summary of what happened during their absence. Everything started with that disease and the declaration of martial law. Dave Fugue. I was gone for like a month, what in the world happened here? Simon revealed how everything started with the disease Seth came across in the north. As they had feared, some of the members of the expedition team had used home call during the chaos of their return. Despite their quick reaction and even getting their hands on an immediate countermeasure thanks to Seth, the disease had managed to dwell and grow in the darkness of Delta. Those hit the hardest by these developments were obviously again the refugees of Sigma. Despite Myanmar's and other factions' great efforts to siphon these people out into the wilderness to found new cities, it was hard to make new homes for the millions of people that made it out of Sigma. The blacksmith and the others had not heard anything of it, as the search and countermeasures had been kept top secret to stop a panic among the populace. It was only some time after their departure that they failed to contain the disease completely and had to come out to the public. Among the chaos, the leadership of Delta used the chance to improve their power. They called out the dusty regulation of martial law, disbanded the weakened guilds, drafted adventurers to form a new force, seized equipment and installed a curfew. It was undeniable that the measures seemed to work, but the landscape of Delta changed drastically. Independent, local powers had been mostly centralized, while the leadership kept supplying their new war machine through connection with foreign powers from the Pathworks. Everything sounded like a dystopian development to the three men, who had a hard time believing it had come this far in such a short time. What in the world was Lena doing while this happened? And what about our guilds, were they really disbanded? Jin asked in a panic. Simon's expression had been solemn the whole time, but a sad glint appeared in his eyes when he heard the name of the princess. He only nodded toward Jin, while he took a deep breath before turning to Seth. Lena isn't here anymore. They used her recent appointment as governor, the dungeon worm business, and the failed containment of the disease to call her back to Krna for an interrogation. The current proxy is one of the people of the 12th prince. He handles things differently. He supported the decisions of Ichabod Longbottom and his faction. Currently, the only thing Krna does is maintain the defenses of Delta. The room fell silent. The fact that Lena was gone was like a rock that was stuck in their throats. At least for Brock and Seth, who knew her personally from the evaluation. There was a lot to process. How is Myanmar dealing with this situation? Seth finally asked. He didn't doubt for a moment that they were just fine, but he still decided to ask just in case he was about to return to an empty home. I don't know any details, but it seems like Myanmar has been ousted. I heard Mary was still going strong, but without you and the others, she is fighting a losing battle against the authorities. They have a bunch of Chosen, the hero, and the slave Mansa on their side. What about Cade? The girl that was always with Lena? She followed Lena to Krna. Before you ask, the Saintess of Samhatch is faring well, albeit losing many of her followers to the disease. I see. This was unfortunate for Yvette, but at least Cade wasn't with the leadership. They didn't talk for much longer as Seth soon made an exit. I will return to Myanmar now. I'm sure Mary and Jane can explain stuff in more detail for me. He had been anxious to return. After hearing Simon's summary, he was sure Mary and the others didn't have it easy. He could already hear the secretaries scolding for not leaving enough manpower or something like that. Chapter 704 Chosen of Hestia. I'm sorry, even after I became the Chosen of Hestia, I couldn't protect our external assets. Mary's first action when he finally arrived was not to scold him but to apologize to him. Jane beside her didn't look much better. He had expected this to be a joyous return. After all, most of the troops he had taken along had reached their level cap or level 90. With that, they had a sizable force with roughly 500 high-level people that were all at least the equivalent to a boss or more thanks to their equipment, stats, or classes. Yet, the situation in Delta was direr than expected. Let's have a meeting and you explain what happened, Seth said with a sigh. Although they were all tired, Seth thought it was best if they all quickly got an idea of the current situation, before taking a break. The lords of Minas Mar and some of the executive members like Karina all assembled in the meeting room, where Mary explained their situation. Over the past month, Ichabod Longbottom had somehow gained unexpected support in the political circle. With the departure of Al, the people she had previously controlled became free elements. Originally, they were still influenced by Mary and her partners, but they had quickly jumped ship over the past month. With their help and the absence of Lena, Longbottom was easily able to push through with his changes. His first step was the enactment of martial law, which gave the government more freedom in its decision-making. They drafted most of the free adventurers as government soldiers and used the gained personnel to forcefully disband the local guilds. Since the most powerful ones had sent their elites to the Holy Land, this was really the easiest part. To protect the citizens and fight the plague, they proceeded to seize the assets of the guilds and confiscated the merchandise of many local shops to equip their new government forces. They promptly used them to enact a curfew and control the populace. During her battle of domestics, Mary had even gained the support of Hestia as she tried to defend Minas Mar's interests. Yet, since her influence had drastically declined, Minas Mar was one of the guilds that were officially disbanded. The people that had supported Minas Mar had been hit especially hard. Mary had managed to save most of their funds and investments as well as their people by gathering everything inside the true Minas Mar, but she had lost their external assets. This meant she was unable to protect their shops and the merchandise inside the shops from being seized. With the interference of the hero, they couldn't even defend their office building on the surface from being taken over. Longbottom has thoroughly dismantled most local powers. Whoever didn't follow him was imprisoned. Many of the fledgling Oath Guards have been stripped of their equipment and put into jail. On the surface, he gains a lot of support from foreign powers through the Pathworks, but I'm certain there is someone else that backs him from the shadows. Otherwise, there is no explanation for his rapid growth in influence. Mary came to a halt. She had been obsessed about this matter for weeks. With the chance to finally vent and let it all out, she had fallen into a lengthy monologue. At some point, it was accompanied by an energetic drumming of fingers on the table. Mary suddenly stopped when she saw Seth's expression after looking for the drumming. It was a deep scowl, that covered the abyss, anger silently bubbling under the surface. The finger drumming on the table had left deep dents at this point. It wasn't like the blacksmith didn't expect that he would at some point clash with the authorities. That was why subconsciously, he was glad Cade had left with Lena. He wasn't a hero, nor was he someone seeking power. He would have never called himself someone who had a problem with authority, either. Even a dystopian society was not necessarily a reason for him to move. He preferred if the place he lived in had civilized order, since it made life easier if there were reasonable customs for everyone to follow. He would never think of disturbing public order and thrusting people's lives in peril for his own selfish gains. However, they touched his stuff. Not only did they have the gall to simply take control of his shops and steal the items he and his dwarven boys made, they even had the gall to evict his own people by force from the building built themselves. They even imprisoned his subordinates. To top it off, all that while seizing a time when he wasn't home, like the bunch of cowards they were. Had he been playing too nice? Arim, Seth. Well, done, Mary. I knew it was the right decision to leave you in charge, but I think we need simpler methods to deal with this situation. He spoke in a controlled and concise manner, but everyone was clear about the thirst for violence swinging along in his voice. Don't look at me like that, it's no like I would overturn a government out of anger. Everyone let out a sigh of relief. The government will still be there, even after I burned the Parliament building to the ground. He joked a joke nobody could help but take seriously. Let's get some rest for tonight. At noon of the next day, Seth was sitting on a big desk inside Minas Mar's business building. Wearing the sleek dark scorpion armor was slightly dissonant with the air of his high-quality office, but Seth didn't intend to change it for a suit. Things had moved quickly. The blacksmith had already decided on a course of action, which saw no opposition during the meeting earlier in the morning. What happened right after the meeting was that a horde of Faer, led by Seth, stormed the office building through the hidden escalator. In one fell swoop they regained their control. They captured all occupants that had made themselves at home in their place and locked them up on a single floor. In the meantime, Evie, Allison, and the other magicians started strengthening their defenses. With the tower system's support, the office building was an almost impregnable fortress. The reason Mary had to give up control was the hero. Without anybody that could stop the walking-talking war machine, their shield would have broken anyway. That was why she chose to retreat. So, I'm currently speaking with the former Tower Master of Minas Mar. Now, Seth was sitting inside his almost unused office with a beautiful lady on the opposite side of the wide desk. In contrast to her very pale white skin, she had fiery dark red hair and a pair of piercing green eyes. Her grey business suit could cover her great figure and only further accentuated it. Despite having everything it took to be a honey trap, her sharp eyes and nonchalant demeanor in the current situation meant she meant business. She was in the middle of enemy territory right now but acted almost playfully. As if she was sure that nothing could happen to her with her backing. She was a negotiator sent in to bargain with them as the outside treated the current situation as a hostage situation. Despite that, the hero was quite prominently standing on the street outside like a warning. Maybe he was the reason she felt so confident. Well, it didn't matter. Right. I am the Tower Master of Minas March. These are our terms. Chapter 705. You are already dead. I think we both know that this is unreasonable, she said with a confident smile. Her speech was sharp and concise, as expected from someone who was convinced to have the upper hand. As expected from someone with a class-like negotiator, Seth could feel the magic power in her voice wash over him, but it was in vain since he wore the raw egg. The bard responded in kind. No, we both know Delta is acting unreasonable. Demanding the return of our possession and the release of people you have unjustly detained, there is nothing unreasonable about this. This is our attempt to reason with you. Her eyes shook as the sharp speech of voice of Seth and other effects surged against her mental defenses. Small droplets of sweat appeared on her smooth forehead and her pale skin took on a slightly pink hue. She sighed. I was sent to see what you wanted. But it is as they said, Minas Mar simply doesn't know their place. I know, you were a big thing but that is over. To think you are trying to pick a fight with Delta after you already lost. This time Seth was truly confused. She was talking like everything was in a distant past and Delta had built up some kind of superpower when all they did was take a chance and act like a spoiled child for the past 4 weeks. You seem very confident. Is it because the little hero is standing out there? Ben Harker Leave 97. Seth had to admit that the hero was a monster. Seeing him with Thathia's discerning eyes would have shocked Seth if it wasn't for Dragos. The hero was not as strong or balanced, but his physical attributes were all somehow above 500. Although he didn't have as many skills, all of them were more impressive than those of the Heart Eater. Still, Seth doubted Harker would be as much of a problem as Dragos posed. It's not just the hero, we also have the Slave Mancer and half a dozen champions. Delta's army consists of 100 players above Leave 80 and several thousand more high-level players. In what world in a guild picking a fight with a whole district reasonable? She spoke with glee, every one of her words oozing with poison. It seemed like she expected her searing speech to be some kind of branding iron that would burn into his ego. In actuality, Seth could hardly hold back a laugh, when she proudly stated the power of Delta. Minas Mar had returned with almost 400 people that would be counted as absolute elites among players. Taking the chimeras they had left behind into account, they had close to 500 elites and close to Leave 90. This was not including Seth's golems and Evie's undead that numbered in the thousands and were in no way weaker. Most powers in Delta had been pooled in the guilds and their elites had been sent to the Holy Land. Even if Longbottom and his cronies had absorbed everything that was left, there was no way they could rival Minas March. Not even Krina could stand in their way if they decided to get involved. Seeing how even Delta's negotiator was full of herself and more interested in trying to intimidate them, instead of actually leading a negotiation, Seth couldn't help but smile. It would have been easier if things worked out this way, but he could say that he didn't want to vent a little. How about a little bet? I will send out someone to fight the hero. If my contestant loses, I release the hostages. If he wins, you fulfill my conditions. How about it? At first, her eyes were widened in surprise, but her expression quickly changed to a self-satisfied smile. Did she think something along the lines of him taking the bait? I agree. But we should make a magic contract so you can't retreat just because you don't like the outcome. She seemed so happy with herself. Ordinarily, she had every reason to. There was no way for the hero to lose to some other player in a fair duel. But who said he would send a player or play fair? Sure, but do you have the authority to sign a magic contract on behalf of Delta? I have, she said and pulled out a golden token. This was a magic item, created with the help of system skills. It could give someone the authority of a system faction standing for the purpose of signing official documents. This was a necessary item, so big organizations couldn't use straw men to take on the punishments for broken contracts. Great! Mary, Can you set up a simple magic contract for us? He called Mary through the intercom and explained the contents. Not long later she came and they both signed the magic document with the system as the witness. When Seth first returned and heard of the things that happened in his absence, he had wanted to lash out, violently and brutally. Although he was sure that their current plans would cut whoever was behind it deeper, it would have been a lie to say that he wasn't happy about the chance to show off some power. We will also need an objective judge. How about Brock, from the Boulder Guild? Although you probably sneakily disbanded his guild while they were away, I'm sure he will judge fairly. What about the slave mancer? He has a good character, she countered. Well, why not both? For the sake of fairness. All right. Let's go outside then and report our friend about his great luck, Seth said with a wide smile after they called their respective judges. He took the lead to step outside together. I always knew you were up to no good, Seth. The blacksmith was greeted by the hero as they stepped outside. I don't want a dirty thing wearing items I made, stolen from my shop to talk to me. Listen to your master and do what you are told, like a good little doggy, Seth scoffed. Harker was shocked at first, but his expression changed when the negotiator lady went over and explained their agreement to him. He gave her a determined nod. Are we doing this right here? He asked Seth, brandishing one of the blacksmith's swords as if it wasn't stolen. Where else? Wolfram. A knight in dull grey armor stepped forward. Nobody saw where he came from, even the hero was surprised by his sudden appearance. The grey knight silently brandished a shield and a staff, facing the hero. The golem had once again grown during the fights in the Holy Land. The whole of the dark knight armor had turned a dull grey, the original color of the angels of the God of Chains. Seth was convinced that Wolfram had already surpassed the initial strength of the angel he once was. I will make this quick to prevent damage to the surroundings, the hero spouted. But before we begin. With a snap from the blacksmith, the hero's armor suddenly unfastened and fell to the ground. The sword he so confidently brandished jumped out of his hand in an almost playful manner. Harker looked up at Seth with confusion and anger in his gaze. You didn't think I would allow you to use my items in this fight, did you? The hero grunted but did not try to pick up the fallen items. He also stopped the negotiator from protesting and simply equipped what seemed like his secondary set, made up of stuff from foreign sources or dungeon drops. He gave Seth the stink eye and stepped forward to face Wolfram. Let's repeat the rules one last time. This is not a duel to the death, losing conditions are either being incapable of keeping on fighting or giving up. Anything you want to add? Brock asked the slave mancer, Rich. All right, then let the match officially begin. The hero charged into attack, but the moment the match began the whole area was covered by a purple barrier centered around Wolfram. Entering the barrier, the speeding hero suddenly lost his momentum as all his skills were blocked. Don't hold back! Seth cheered as Wolfram suddenly vanished and almost teleported behind Harker. Nothing personal, kid. He stated and started thrashing the hero with the metal staff. Despite having his skills blocked, the hero managed to block and divert many of the strikes, despite Wolfram reaching a speed that left several phantoms during his attacks. Ha ha ha! Your attacks are about as strong as a mosquito's, the hero laughed, but Wolfram suddenly came to a halt, some distance away from him. You're already dead. What? From several places across the hero's body, wherever Wolfram had hit him, grey patches of metal quickly expanded. Ben Harker's body was rapidly transmuted into the same grey dull metal Wolfram was made of. You must be joking. He screamed his last words before finally turning into a silent statue with his face screaming to the sky as if questioning the injustice of the world. Chapter 706 Internal Announcement. Looking at the completely transmuted hero that had turned into a metal statue, even Seth was shocked for a moment, not to mention the peanut gallery of soldiers and adventurers. He was confident that Wolfram would win, but he didn't expect the golem to one-sidedly trounce the hero. Seth was surprised, maybe a little shocked, but for guys like the slave mancer, the soldier, or the negotiator lady, a world was falling apart. The pivot point, the one thing they put their unconditional trust in, had just been broken like a child's toy. This was supposed to be a non-lethal match. Rich, the slave mancer cried out angrily. As the cruel reality of the situation finally sank in, everyone reacted differently, though the most common was anger. The only person who seemed just as frozen as the hero, was the negotiator lady, who was staring at the statue, trying hard to deny the very reality before her eyes. Kaie. When she was forced to accept it by the angry voices around her, she fell to her knees and let out a scream filled with despair. "Aren't you guys a little overdramatic? It's not like Harker is dead, as long as nobody breaks the statue, that is. You just have to find someone to purify him and he will be as good as new. Of course, you should first declare the outcome of this match," Seth spoke nonchalantly to Rich and the crowd. "I declare Minasmar the winner of this duel." "The hero Ben Harker can no longer fight," Brock readily threw in. He had also been shocked, but he was slowly getting used to Minasmar being outside of his expectations. Rich was shiftily looking left and right as if looking for an excuse, but he couldn't come up with one. Finally, he had no choice but to agree with Brock and declare Minasmar the winner. Seth stepped to the wailing negotiator and shoved a stack of papers in her face. "That is a copy of the inventories from the turquoise and copper anvil, and their marked prices. Don't forget, I want all of it back or a compensation of 1.5 times the price. I will give you a few days to get my stuff back, but I hope to see my detained people by the evening." After saying his piece he turned around and walked back into his office building. Wolfram and Brock followed him. With the guarantee of the magic contract, the hostages were released and the encirclement around the building was relaxed. "Why are you following me, too?" Seth suddenly turned to Brock, after the doors closed. I don't know. I just went along." "Oh, on that note, what is Minasmar planning? Why do you ask? Wanna join us?" Although Brock and the Boulder Guild had the least losses, apart from Minasmar, they had also been officially disbanded. Many of their members had lost their jobs and were either poached or detained. Seth couldn't imagine how it would have been for them to return to an empty place. "Maybe we could join as an auxiliary guild." Brock actually took the offer. It actually played well into their future plans. Seth didn't mind scouting some auxiliary guilds, as Brock had phrased it. The more power and people they siphoned out from Delta, the better it was. "Sure, I will tell you how we continue once we have our stuff and our people back." As he asked for, around evening a crowd of people appeared at the doors of the office building of Minasmar. Although there was some confusion mixed in, everyone was happy to have their freedom back. They were the staff from the shops and members of the Oath Guard that had acted as guards across the city. Many wanted to directly go home to look for their families but were stopped by other staff. "Please don't worry, we have already made preparation for your families inside," Mary calmed them down. Some of these people had been in detainment for weeks, not knowing how their family members were doing. Although Mary had been unable to do anything for them, she had shown her capability by taking care of and assembling these people from the shadows. With the encirclement slightly scattering, the first thing they had done was bring over their families for a reunion, and not just the families of those that had been detained. There were also the relatives of the 80 Oath Guards that had come along on the expedition to the Holy Land. Especially the staff and relatives that were originally living in Delta were now assembled here. They would have to make a decision soon. A few days later a depressed negotiator lady appeared at their doorstep with several boxes full of items and system currency. They keep some items and many of the potions had been used, they could not do anything but compensate with money. "Thanks, you can leave now." "What are you planning?" the lady suddenly exclaimed nervously. Even with the system's assistance and skills, she was not cut out for something like a negotiator. The boxes were quickly brought in by a pair of golems. Seeing how Longbottom didn't act up during the past days, it seemed like everyone was adopting a wait-and-see tactic. They all waited to see what Minasmar would do. "You will know soon. We will announce our plan openly and publicly," Seth said with a smile before he returned to the building, leaving her alone outside. With everything stashed away, it was time. It had been a few days since Brock, and the Boulder Guild had been invited to Minasmar's business building. Those that decided to stay with the guild had also brought in their relatives, fearing the wanton action of Delta's martial law. It was the morning after Delta kept its contractual obligations. Brock and the two chosen ones were now sitting in a big auditorium meant for speeches. They could see some familiar faces from Minasmar's field teams, chimeras, and oath guards among the audience. There were also unfamiliar people. Humans and chimeras he had never seen, cat people, there was even a massive minotaur standing in one corner, looking menacing. He also spotted Jin and some others from the remnants of the guilds. Brock had heard that Jin had arrived yesterday, with a similar request as Brock. The reason they were all here was that Minasmar was finally going to give an internal announcement. Although they were the only ones seeing it live, Brock observed several screens being installed all across the building. With all the people and relatives of people, the building was packed and Brock heard that everyone would be able to follow the announcement live on the screens. What could be so important, that everyone had to hear it in person. As Brock was puzzling over this question, Seth, the Tower Master, stepped on the rostrum to give his speech. You all have seen the changes in Delta. Over the past few days, we have communicated with the System Church and our contact in Krina and have come to a decision. We have the resources, the facilities, the territory, and the military strength. We are not dependent on Delta. Tomorrow morning Myanmar will officially announce its status as an independent district of Earth. Chapter 707 Internal Announcement, 2. Some shocked gasps echoed in the silence after the bomb was dropped. This building will be our embassy and the tree root our land. What does all this mean to you? It means all of you will have a choice to make. You all have seen and experienced the current Delta, will you stay here or will you stand with Myanmar? Seth paused to let what he just announced sink in. The separation from the governmental structure that existed prior to the apocalypse and the foundation of essentially a new nation. It seemed like an obvious choice, but the decision was harder than one may think. They had other options. Seth could have used ego to try and strong-arm Delta into compliance. They could have used force, or even try to turn everything around with political schemes and magic powers. However, all of it was bothersome. In the end, there was someone behind Longbottom. Someone with a goal. Someone who schemed from the shadows but played by the rules in the open. Delta was a murky and complicated swamp to Seth, and the blacksmith just didn't want to deal with it. And why should he? In comparison to all that, going independent was easier. They had back all their stuff. The people that were important were here. Once he cut ties with Delta, he would just have to protect what was his. And if people suffered under Delta's rule? Well, they could always migrate to Myanmar. I know, this may sound scary, dystopian even. Society splintering apart in the face of the apocalypse. A totalitarian regime led by a single organization that has no worldly power to answer to. And it's exactly that. I will be brutally honest. In our current world, power is the only thing one can trust. Whether one gains power themselves or follows those with power for protection. You have all made your choices. Myanmar has power. The question you have to ask yourselves is, do you trust us? Will you trust us not to abuse our power, even without an obsolete system watching our hands? We promise to adopt the common laws of Earth. We promise to work with the System Church and Krina. We promise the tree station's self-governance. But all of this means nothing if you don't trust us, and our promises. Once we announce our independence tomorrow morning, all of you have the choice to stay with us, or cut ties with us and fend for yourselves in Delta. Seth paused again. He knew that this was a heavy decision he asked from these people. One might even call it unfair, to ask them to decide to leave their homes for an uncertain future within a matter of a day. Although Mary had assured him that everyone had a good opinion of them and would surely join, Seth wanted to be as honest as possible. The bard had deliberately not used the voice of Seth, or any other active speech skills. He knew that this was a hard decision that could lead to him losing many of his people, but he wanted them to make a true and mostly unaffected decision. There was no use in persuading people that would come to regret their choice later on and blame him. But of course, there was no reason not to sweeten the deal. I know, this is a hard decision I ask of you. Especially of those who have lived in Delta their whole life. But I guarantee you, that it won't be to your disadvantage. We offer all members of Myanmar and their family members free housing at a tree station and location of their choice. The offer of free housing also extends to any citizen of Earth that decides to migrate to Myanmar before tomorrow morning or is guaranteed for by one of the members or their families. If you have any questions pertaining to migration and housing, you can ask our staff members. With free housing, he struck an instinct that had already persisted for a long time before the apocalypse and had only grown stronger afterward. On Earth, where living costs were cheap in general, thanks to low energy prices and technical advancements like automated subterranean farming, rent was the biggest cost and worry for the people. After the apocalypse, the location where one lived became more important and the prices fluctuated strongly. Offering free housing didn't come at any cost for Myanmar, since they owned everything in the tree stations, but it was a massive bait for ordinary citizens. By offering the same to people from Delta that came at a recommendation by people already present here, would allow people to possibly bring their whole social circle, the one thing apart from the nostalgia that could bind them to Delta. Myanmar on the other hand, wouldn't complain about having more people to fill them and work at the tree stations. The bard made it clear that now was the golden time to join, awakening the fear of missing out as an additional factor. After the official announcement of independence, the migration process would become a lot stricter and obviously, housing would not be free anymore. After all, Minas Mar wasn't running a charity. Ending his speech with the announcement of the housing, the screens across the building finally turned off. What about Delta and Epsilon? Do you think they will accept a new district? Jin asked into the room after the speech ended. Even if they don't, what can they do? Neither economic nor military sanctions are a threat to us. They can acknowledge it or not, it won't change anything. Jin didn't say any more. He and the others adventurers that came from outside had seen what Minas Mar was able to do, more so than even the staff or their families. It was hard to believe that Delta could have anything that could rival Minas March. Especially with the hero suffering an anticlimactic defeat. Well, then, I will see all of you again tomorrow morning. Then we will see how many new citizens our new district will have. The audience in the auditorium had changed. There were still the lords of Minas Mar, some other members, and people from the new auxiliary guilds, yet the biggest part was made up of strangers that were invited. They were representatives of the current biggest media outlets of Delta. Their business had been recovering well after the districts started stabilizing again. Not just that, they were also the quickest to adopt the new technologies introduced by Krina for their own needs. Now they had been invited by Minas Mar, the one guild that had not only made a thunderous return but also bit back against the overreaching leadership of Delta. The guild that had single-handedly defeated the Ben Harker, the dog of the regime, in a fair duel. What do you think this is about? I bet it's about their plans from now on. Do you think they will address the duel with Harker? Why are we even here? We shouldn't speak with this kind of terrorists. Wild assumptions were whispered among the excited journalists, but some also had negative opinions of Minas March. After all, they did retake their building with force and used hostages to force a negotiation. All the clamoring died down when the Tower Master finally ascended the stage. I welcome all of you, as representatives of Delta's media. You have been invited today to bear witness to a joyous moment. The birth of a new district. After Delta's transgressions and unjustifiable decisions over the past month, we have decided to declare our independence as the new district of Minas March. It followed a shocked silence before the room exploded in a storm of questions. With a sigh, Seth sat down in his quarters. The press conference was finally over. They had worked a lot over the past few days to prepare and manage their independence. The conference had been like a recap of everything that happened in such a short amount of time. Heavy thoughts burdened Seth's mind. Even though this seemed like the easiest way out, the blacksmith started to realize that he probably couldn't continue just being. A pair of gentle hands suddenly wandered over his back up to his shoulder and interrupted his thoughts. He could already smell her mild perfume before she whispered into his ears. Hugging him from behind, her soft mounts pressed against his back. We should celebrate, she quietly breathed in his ear. I'm not really in the mood. Her hug became tighter and her soft cheek rubbed against his. I know, and that is exactly why. Even if you tried to hide it, I know that the past few days have burdened you. We are not cut out for this political stuff. What you need is a distraction. We all need a break to relax after the past month and especially these days. It was weird that he only noticed how tired he was after Mina drew his attention to it. She was right, they all needed a break and a way to vent. Okay, let's do that. I will open the banquet hall tomorrow. Good, there is also someone I want to introduce to you tomorrow. But for today, you are mine. With that, the poor blacksmith fell prey to a ravenous beast and was not seen again, until morning. Chapter 708 A Confession. Seth woke up to a maelstrom of golden locks covering his eyes. Trying to move the hair, he found both his arms occupied with other duties. Blowing the hair away from his face, he found a fair beauty in each of his hands. One was Mina and the other was the origin of the golden locks. Looking at her peaceful sleeping face, Seth remembered finally what happened at the party yesterday. The party had already been going for some time and the banquet hall was steeped in chaotic fun as everyone was already drunk. Wait here a moment, I want to introduce you to someone, Mina suddenly said and separated from him to run off somewhere. Seth had not waited for long before Mina returned. Following her was a drop-dead gorgeous lady with bright golden locks down to the hips and skin like honey. She wore a tight black evening dress that emphasized her petite, yet toned body. Standing before him was Finn and not Finn. The small fairy brute had turned into a human woman, but on her face had the same mischievous smile he knew from the small troublemaker. His heart throbbed. There was no way he couldn't recognize her. How do I look? She asked with a confident smile, puffing up her modest chest. The blacksmith just stood there, with his mouth open. Speechless, hee. I have been working hard to be able to turn into a human, so I can tell you something I have been meaning to tell you for a long time. She paused and nervously looked back at Mina standing behind her with a bright smile, giving her a thumbs up. What were these two planning? Seth could only swallow his saliva in anticipation. Seth, I love you, she said seriously, having dropped her cutesy way of speaking. Suddenly his heart palpitated. He liked Finn too, a lot. But he liked Mina even more, enough to call it love. For a moment he thought of making a joke like, sorry, Finn, I like Amelia, but this wasn't the time. He wanted to face her seriously. Finn, he caressed her cheek. It was smooth and soft. Although he was bad at social stuff, he was glad not to be a dense protagonist, who didn't notice her feelings before. Otherwise, this might have been troubling, but Seth already had his answer. You know I'm not good with this kind of serious emotional stuff. It's exactly why I love Mina, for making it easy and uncomplicated. I don't know if I can love you the same way I love Mina. It might be unfair to you, to say yes now and hog you for myself, when there might be someone out there that can make you happier and love you better than I can. He paused. Suddenly, Finn charged forward and hugged him tightly. Idiot, I know that. Still, I want to try. Human lives are so short. You barely live a century, maybe a few decades more, maybe some less if you are unlucky. I want to use the time I have with you, as much as possible. Even if you won't be the true love of my life, I don't even know if there is something like that. I want to make more memories with you, stronger memories, deeper ones. You are the first one in over 200 years I want to try with. Don't belittle me, if this doesn't work out I won't cling to it like some needy bitch. If you suck as a boyfriend, I will leave you, she finished jokingly, but Seth could hear her voice waver a little and he embraced her tightly. He couldn't suppress a laugh of relief as he continued. You should let a man finish his answer, he whispered in her ear. What I was going to say is, that guy can go take a hike. I'm not going to push you away, especially when Mina is more likely to scold than praise me. But there is one thing you should know, he added with a grin. She looked up at him in surprise, their noses almost touched. I am a man that wants to be conquered. If you want my love, you have to win me over. But don't think I will let you run off once you have it. What is this about leaving me if I suck? Even if I suck, I demand commitment, he said, half serious and half joking. This was his answer. Finn's eyes jumped open wide when he gave him a passionate kiss. Everything past that was a whirl of passion and fun, which brought him to the present. A warm bed, and two beautiful women at his side. He couldn't help but laugh. Who would have expected that he would ever experience being such a lucky bastard? After the announcement and celebration, Minasmar experienced a long and peaceful morning. Delta on the other hand was in an uproar with the publication of the things discussed during the press conference. Many different voices became loud, both positive and negative. Many people doubted the legitimacy, or even the possibility of someone simply founding their own nation or district out of the blue. A lot of people discussed the laws and legislation pertaining to this. There had been no countries with the foundation of the districts, and the newest district was still Delta with several decades of age. However, there had never been any laws against people leaving the district and living in the no man's land. The biggest question was whether this even mattered in the current situation. If it did, wouldn't there be more and more people simply leaving and trying to create their own nation? Many also demanded for new laws to be made about the treatment of the no man's land. With people once again settling there, this needed to be regulated. Yet, who was going to regulate it? The district barely had enough power to protect itself. Apart from these more political discussions, there were three camps in general. The first were those who had bought into the anti-Minasmar propaganda. They heavily criticized Minasmar's independence for several reasons. From supposed worry about their treatment of people once they didn't have to answer to the jurisdiction of Delta, to outright stating outlandish claims like Minasmar owing Delta something. The second was clear supporters of Minasmar, that had faced the negative consequence of Longbottom rise to power. Drafts, martial law, and curfews went against a civilized society in their opinion. Especially the way they were enforced was barbaric. In ordinary times, it was an easy option to simply leave by train and move to a different district. But now only two were left. Although Delta was changing, it was far from being as bad as what people heard about Epsilon, where the leadership reigned with an iron grip lately. With Minasmar declaring their independence as a district, meant that they would be able to migrate to the tree route, which was arguably safer and freer than the current delta. Before Minas Mar was a business, so only selected people could actually join and move to permanently live at the tree stations. If these places were given the right to govern themselves, it also meant that citizens from other districts would be able to simply move there. This was the opinion of many that were tempted by a new way of life and the tales of the cities grown from trees. The only hurdle was the journey. Yet, few people doubted their ability to reach the tree stations. The tree route counted as the safest place outside the districts. Even those without combat power could simply hire adventurers or join merchantries to travel along the former trade route. Minas Mar even offered a monthly escort for selected personnel. People could either apply for a free place based on a resume of their skills and level or buy a relatively expensive ticket for a seat with Minas Mar's official escort. The third camp was the fence-sitters. It was uncertain how Delta would react to this news, especially after the provocation by taking hostages, transmuting Ben Harker, and forcefully taking back what was theirs. Not just theirs, many eyes were laying on Delta's leadership, to see how they would react. Chapter 709. VIP Treatment. Following the peaceful morning, a messenger appeared asking to meet Seth. It was not someone sent by Delta, but one of Alzalsar's people. The sorceress had assembled a sizable collection of boy toys, but also useful people in her property at the Red Light District. They were not technically part of Minas Mar, but they were in charge of the Ithildan refinery Al had set up inside the building. It was one of the few connections to Surface Delta, and a reason why they decided to set up something like an embassy. Another one was the auction house and the system bank. They were still in the middle of talks to set up branches of the auction house and the system bank in Tree Station 1. Still, from Minas Mar, the magic tower, Delta was still closer. They didn't worry about Delta making a move on Al's property and the people living there. The reason was simple: the Lich's abode was probably the safest building in Delta. Even better secured than the Parliament or Minas Mar's embassy. The same could be said about her people. Seth doubted that the sorceress would leave her lovers defenseless when she was a master enchanter able to whip up relic and legendary rated items on the go. A couple of days earlier they had sent the proposal they made to the staff from Delta, to the people of Alzalsar's home, but received a unanimous refusal. With Al's preparations for them, none of them had any reason to move, even if Delta turned into a hellscape. Instead, they assured their services to continue to refine Ithildan as the sorceress had instructed them to, and that they would soon send someone with the first big batch. The day after the big announcement, the carrier of presents appeared on their doorstep. Hearing that a whole box of Ithildan arrived for him, Seth got slightly excited. He couldn't deny that he had neglected the material in the past months, because of his success in making legendary Olympian silver. Although Ithildan was only an epic metal, it was the best epic metal there was, and something that had to be kept in mind, that every Ithildan was different, despite being Ithildan. Since it was mithril that was refined with the power of the moon, its properties could slightly differ depending on the world it was refined in. Its basic property of the highest monoconductivity of all materials, not including materials of specific elements, always stayed the same. It also seemed to have a good affinity with souls and the night, but there could be additional effects depending on the moon. With the one refined on Earth, Seth had experienced three kinds of Ithildan. One was the spear made by Forgebrand and made of Ithildan of undetermined origin. Compared to the Ithildan he had gotten from Poulter's people, it had an even higher monoconductivity but no other special characteristics. Then there was the huge amount of Ithildan that he had gotten from the dwarfs in exchange for the mithril door they had looted from the cursed dragon's hoard. This Ithildan was surprisingly sturdy as Olympian silver of the same tier. Which was why Seth had decided to also use it for vessels and some armor. Now the one of Earth, he had not yet worked with. Alzalsar formation for the refinement of Ithildan only worked on full moons, and the first full moon since the completion happened while they were away. Although the sorceress had brought him samples, Seth had been preoccupied with other projects at the time. Despite the whole business of going independent, he was a lot freer now than before. Many of his friends had gained power from the gods, whether they were chosen or received blessings. They had also returned with a sizable force of golems and undead. Since he also reached the master tier in most of his skills, he was not as driven for results anymore. With all the materials they brought back from the Holy Land, Seth could spend more time refining his craftsmanship and experimenting on items. The messenger of Alzalsar's domicile was not the last one. A lot of people came by congratulations, presents, and proposals after the public announcement of Minas Mar's decision. Many belonged to businesses that had joined them or followed their expansion outward. Some also belonged to businesses that had held to Myanmar previously and experienced especially harsh treatment in the recent weeks thanks to this. Most of them directly, or indirectly, asked to move to, or even play a role in the development of the other tree stations along the tree route. They shared their intention to not just invest but commit and move their complete businesses and what was left of their assets. Obviously, they hoped for preferential treatment. Seth left those kinds of people to marry. As the chosen of Hestia, she didn't just gain strength, but she was now a champion of domestics. Seth only met 3 people personally. The first was Al's handsome boy toy that brought the box of Ithildan. The second was actually a messenger of the auction house and not just anyone. It is great to finally meet the great craftsman personally. My name is Mehdi Bar, I'm the branch manager of the interdimensional auction house in Delta. I'm sorry for my late visit, he introduced himself politely and apologized with a bow. This was the first time they met personally. Although Seth was an avid user of the auction house, he never bothered with the staff there. He knew that Mary had met him a few times in their attempt to have a branch set up in Tree Station 1. Hello, Manager Bar. What brings you here to visit personally today? Seth asked with some interest. After all, the manager had asked to meet him in person, despite coming without a prior appointment. Intrigued, the blacksmith invited him to his lounge where they could speak comfortably. It is to deliver something of great importance. I know how this may look, but please do not misunderstand our intentions, because of the circumstances. With this, Mehdi placed a device on the coffee table between them. It was roughly the size of a smartphone with similar dimensions. The difference was that it looked like a smooth slab of silver and not an electronic device. Curiously, Seth kept looking at the manager, waiting for him to explain. This is a personal VIP terminal to access our auction house. I had ordered its production as a congratulatory gift for your ascension to the master grade. It is simply that this kind of device takes a long time to be made and can only be handed over to the recipient in person, Bar explained. He knew that currently it just looked like the auction house was currying favor with Mina's march. The manager knew this, which was why he explained the process and stressed that it really wasn't the case. Seth didn't mind either way. It was a bigger revelation for him, that there were probably many people who knew he had become a master at this point. A master of several skills at that, since all his items, even those he made in the past, now stated his name and skill tier. He knew it subconsciously, but this was the first time he faced the consequence of this. At this point, did it even make sense to hide his name on the rankings? Anybody with a good appraisal skill that saw one of his items would probably make the connection at this point. Even if you are an Orihuma, we were very surprised how quickly you reached the master tier, in several skills at that. This is the reason why we decided to offer you a personal interface. Right, they weren't currying favor with Myanmar, the new and rising district, but with Seth. Why? Because he was a money printer. As long as a master used the auction house to sell items, they would make tons just from their small split on the final price. You just have to infuse your magic power onto the terminal and it will register you as the owner, granting you VIP access to the auction house. He also explained what VIP access meant. It came with quite a few quality of life enhancements when using the auction house. Preferential advertisement of his products, lowered prices when it came to interdimensional purchases, and he could even buy on credit up to a certain limit overall. It was something Seth happily accepted. I understand your intentions. Thank you for such a gracious gift. I will definitely use it to my heart's content. They only talked for a short while longer, since the manager was a busy man and had to return to his branch. Also, the third visitor was already waiting for Seth in the lobby. It was the guild master of the Adventurer Guild. Chapter 710. Why me? The Adventurer Guild had asked for a conversation for a while, but things had been delayed because of current occurrences. Seth had been busy in the past few days, and so they made an appointment for the day after the announcement. With that, people from the Adventurer Guild were the only ones that showed up with an actual appointment. To make things grander, it was not just the guild's vice master who usually took care of public appearances. Stepping into Seth's office was the elusive guild master of the Adventurer Guild. He had actually appeared in their embassy. Unlike the vice guild master who always looked a little shifty and word items, the guild master had really adapted to Earth, to the point Seth thought he was a local. With a tailor-made suit and slicked back blonde hair, he looked almost like a business mogul, if it wasn't for the massive scar along his cheek, which gave him more of a mobster vibe. The last time Seth saw him was during the Great Assembly, but they had never spoken. His appearance here showed how serious of a situation it was. It seemed like they had not only lost contact with the stronghold, but with all adventurers in the Holy Land. It seemed like all of their forces had been wiped out, which made them desperate for information. "Hello Tower Master, it is nice to finally meet you in person." Seth rose from his seat to shake his hand. "Hello, Guild Master. It is, although I didn't expect today to be the day. Come and have a seat. Do you want something to drink?" After the pleasantries were over and everyone was supplied with a hit drink of their choosing, Steb brought out 2 sheets of paper. "I'm sure you have a lot of questions about what happened in the Holy Land and I have just the right witness that wants to talk with you, but please sign these first." "What is this?" Bryce asked as he started to read the paper. "Oh, just a simple non-disclosure agreement pertaining to sensitive information that may come up in this conversation but have no direct correlation to the information you are seeking." It was something Mary had whipped up for this conversation. It was as the bard explained, a simple magic contract that forbids the disclosure of information such as the identity of the witness, or information about Seth and his skills he might mention. Bryce thoroughly checked the agreement and even used an enchanted magnifying glass to make sure there were no hidden clauses. Only after he was sure that there were no traps, did he nod to the Vice Master and they both signed the papers. "All right, Beemant, you can come in," Seth called out after he checked that the contracts were active. "Beemant," the 2 guys from the Adventurer Guild called out in surprise as the tall adventurer entered the room. Seth decided it was for the best if he left the recollection of what happened to the guild's expedition to Beemant, the original leader of said people. This was also the reason for the NDAs, as it would have been hard to explain his survival and what happened without mentioning some of Seth's powers. The blacksmith could be the audience for the most part and left the talking to the guild people. His turn only came at the end, when the questions turned to the attacker. Seth described his short encounter with the monstrous man, his overall stats, and the suspected source of his power. With the magic contract that shut them up, Seth didn't have to come up with many lies, though he still didn't just reveal everything. He only mentioned that he had gained the limited ability to revive someone as his subordinate thanks to a blessing and having an item that could turn him invisible. Although the first was rare, the latter was nothing unheard of. Just recently there had been a whole wave of invisible attackers in Delta. "Here, I can give some of these, if you know a witch, dark magician or shaman specialized in curses and hexes," Seth ended his report of the events. He brought out a small box where he kept the toes, fingers and slices of meat he had managed to find after Dragos successfully escaped from him. It was for exactly this kind of purpose. A special kind of curses and shamanic magic had great power and utility if the caster possessed a piece of the target. When hair, finger or toenails were already sufficient, full toes, fingers, and slices of meat and bones had to work even better, right? This was his fail-safe. Even if Dragos managed to get away, with so many pieces of him, Seth was sure he could make the man's life hell, or outright end it, as long as he found the right specialists. Bryce and the Vice Guild Master barely kept their expressions from derailing when Seth proudly displayed sliced pieces of people's meat to them like a butcher. For their mental health, they didn't look closer into what exactly was in the box. "Ah, Arim, well..." the Vice Guild Master stuttered. "Vice Guild Master. Please, take a toe and a finger and keep them safe," the Guild Master said seriously, staring into the void somewhere above the chest with gory bits. "You mean wait, why me?" "Because the Guild Master asked you to, Vice Guild Master." With an unwilling expression, the Vice Guild Master gave in and rummaged around in the chest until he retracted his hand with a big toe and a pinky finger. "A last question, Beemant. What happened to the basement of the stronghold?" Seth stared at his new subordinate. It was clear that the Guild Master was asking about the materials they had smuggled away. He wanted to see how Beemant would act. The man's face darkened in grief. "It was completely destroyed, Guild Master. I'm sorry." He was given a performance he would have never expected. Was that a tear? Did that massive muscle man just push out a tear? What was with that award-winning acting? The sorrow on his face seemed so real. There was no way to tell that he was actually lying. "I see. That would be all from us. Thank you for your cooperation, Tower Master." Bryce was controlling his emotions well, as he stood up to shake Seth's hand and bid farewell. The Adventurer Guild had lost a lot with this expedition, more than even the guilds of Delta. He did well, just having a waxen expression as he left the office. "Isn't there anything we can do?" The one unhappiest with the overall situation was most likely Ichabod Longbottom. Minasmar had completely embarrassed Delta's leadership in front of the public. Not only had they defeated the hero with laughable ease and forced Delta to comply, but now they even announced their independence. Frustration was eating away at Ichabod's mind. He had done everything as he was told and everything was going swimmingly, just like they said. But the moment that despicable Tower Master returned, it was all because of that reliable hero. He dared to lose, but even worse, he lost in such an embarrassing way. Now they were stuck with having to find a saint or bishop that could lift the curse. Otherwise, they would lose even more reputation. Is there really nothing we can do? We have been researching the old legislations for a way to interfere, but we have found nothing yet. The wording is very clear. Any people that wish to live outside of the districts are allowed to do so. Ichabod tore at his hair. Old laws were no help to him. They had been very lax during the foundation of the district, fearing the backlash of the people. The humans had been enticed to move to the districts, not forced. The only restriction was about big corporations stationed within the districts not being allowed to exploit natural resources outside of the districts to make profits inside. However, bringing this old law up now was just shooting his own foot. In their current situation, it was political suicide to try and stop the influx of resources from outside. It wasn't just about local forces, he would also bring the external forces up against him if he interfered in this. With Minas Mar declaring their independence, even if they called themselves a district, they were an external entity, which guaranteed them autonomy by the old laws. They could restrict trade with Minas Mar, but this only brought them back to the first problem of interfering with the flow of resources. Minas Mar controlled and maintained the only safe trade route between Delta and the outside. The only way left was force. If they wiped them out and took over the trade route. As his thought kept spiraling down and kept going in that direction, only to be denied, he felt his special communication token vibrate. Yes, he answered the call in a hurry. Do nothing. But we will take care of this. Just keep managing your side and keep the losses to a minimum. Stabilize your position. That is all we need you to do. If you do a good job, you will be rewarded. Got it? Yes. Understood. Chapter 711 Helping. The next few days, Minas Mar was flooded with people wishing to migrate. This time it was not only refugees, but many of the people in question were those hit the hardest by the new martial law and Delta's actions. Local production classes. Like Oriabel, many people that were professional craftsmen before the apocalypse had chosen to return to their profession and chose a fitting class later on. They also had much of their merchandise confiscated, which crippled their businesses. Seeing no future like this, many applied to join Minas Mar or migrate to the tree route. It was the first time that Seth actually became busy in his position as head of the crafting department. It was on him to decide who would be scouted and who would be allowed to migrate. The blacksmith moaned at the stacks of papers that filled his desk. Despite these already being pre-sorted based on several criteria by other staff, they were still a discouraging amount of work. He wanted to get back in his workshop and work with the new materials and souls. But he knew this work was necessary. They had brought a lot of materials from the Holy Land. Even more than they could store. Much of it was below the level that could help him, Whedon, or Hone. They could have sold them, but it seemed like a waste. Finding some promising people and growing them to bulk up their craft force was more attractive. This was also a way to diversify and make the best use of the stored material. There were not just blacksmiths, but also leather workers and bowers like Bess and Daimon. They had a great source of powerful wood with the hanging tree and a huge stockpile of leathers that would finally see some good use. Even some herbalists and alchemists that showed promise applied to join. Similarly, Minas Mars had a great herb garden that became even more powerful with the help of herbalist Otto, Karina, and Karina's pupils. Compared to their facilities and supplies, alchemists and herbalists were underrepresented. But they couldn't just provide the materials. With people like Allison, the dwarfs, and the Faer to coach newcomers, there was no doubt would be able to grow quickly and become just the people they needed to supply the new copper anvils they would open in Tree Station 1 and along the tree route. The new turquoise anvil would also open in Tree Station 1. Seth had no intention of selling things directly in Delta ever again. If people in Delta wanted something from Minas Mar, they would have to rely on merchants from the tree route to sell it with a hike-up. While people needed to undergo a thorough background check to join Minas Mar, the criteria to move to the tree route were a lot laxer. As long as someone had the right skill level, they would be directly allowed. Depending on their skill level, they may even get preferential treatment. Seth had nothing to do with these people as they had already been sorted out of the applications that made their way to him. By relaxing their strict requirements for the migration, they siphoned out most of the talented people in Delta. The reason was not overly complex. Their actions would have consequences. If the useful production classes left, the supply within Delta would decline, making the district more reliant on external sources. At first glance, this may seem like they were playing Ichabod right in his hands. The current Chancellor of Delta had been moving to strengthen external powers and weaken the local ones. However, now something had changed. The people had a way out. Before Delta was a land surrounded by deadly mountains, the citizens with a low average level or classes with low combat power had no choice but to stay. They couldn't seek their fortune in the wilderness. They were an easy-to-exploit human resource. But now Minas Mar had opened their gates. You don't like how things are in Delta? Explore the tree route. Maybe settle in one of the tree stations? Or join one of the many ventures that branch out from the tree route. Emigration into the no-man's lands offered a chance for success for everyone. At least more than Delta. By indirectly helping Longbottom turn Delta into a shitty place to live, they got an unending stream of people filling the tree route and got to play the good guys. On that note, Delta did surprisingly little to stop them or go against them in any way. It was an easy-to-predict trend, but the leadership didn't seem to have any intention to move to stop it. The best part was, that all they had to do was keep doing what they had been doing anyways and raking in rent. Governing people was hard and complicated, and none of them wanted to do that. They were all normal people before and had no interest in these things. Not even Mary, who was the most fitting to be one, didn't want to become a politician. This was why they chose a handoff approach and decided to let the people govern themselves based on the laws of Earth. Even when the tree stations were given autonomy and they would not interfere much with people's lives, the whole city was still owned by them. The money would come to them either way. Although that was a risky approach as the success depended on the elected leaders, they had been lucky so far, since Vlad had been doing great work in leading the people of Sigma in Tree Station 1. Although Seth did not really like him for his actions in the past, he was a good governor. As long as similarly dependable people got the job in the currently smaller tree stations, there was nothing to worry about. Are you still working? You should take a break. Mina entered his office. Yeah, come eat with us. Finn invited, sitting on her shoulder. The blacksmith was tired of reading applications and stood up to take a break without hesitation. His girlfriends asked for his attention. He still had an incredulous smile, every time he thought about it. These days, the only relaxation Seth experienced was when he spent his time with Finn and Mina. He had been a little worried about things becoming strained after that night, but if anything changed, then it was that their relationship had become even less complicated. If anything threw a shade on their time together, it was the state of the current Delta. Clubs and bars had to close early. The curfew effectively killed the nightlife. They could not even go out to have a nice meal in a fine dining restaurant in the evening. One could feel it. The heavy atmosphere that hung over Delta also ruined shopping or simply eating out. New movies had been indefinitely delayed, so going to the movie theater also fell flat. They couldn't really enjoy going out on dates anymore. Although the Demon District was not as affected by these changes, it wasn't a place to go on dates. The silver lining was that they had more time for couple stuff at home. Seth wasn't going to complain about it. Seth wasn't the only busy one. While the blacksmith was preoccupied with the administrative work for the crafting team, it was the same for the other lords. After all, there were not only production classes asking to join. Although craftsmen were at the forefront of people applying to join, there were also many adventurers that wanted to use the chance to explore the outside. In general, Minas Mar would not send any good people away. The trustworthy ones were offered to join the Oath Guard or were deferred to the new auxiliary guilds, like the Boulder Guild and the new Checkers Guild under Jin Ness. Other talented individuals that didn't wish to join Minas Mar but just wanted to migrate were offered preferential treatment. Everyone else couldn't expect any help, but they also wouldn't be denied entry to the tree stations, if they managed to get there on their own. A big help in this was actually Jack Felton. The instructor was at the forefront of interviewing promising applicants. Thanks to his class and life experience, he was the most practiced in judging someone's character and skill. Not only that, but he had also indirectly shaped the structure of the Oath Guard, a growing dependable leader like Ortega that could also take on some of the administrative work. Apart from the few leaders with the talent to help the Oath Guard, the Faer and the Chimeras were the only people not doing anything actively. Many had either reached Leave 90 or their personal max level. As their most presentable force, they were on standby in case Delta unexpectedly ended up doing something. They currently spent most of their training or technically having a break since there were no dungeons or hunting grounds in Delta that could help them grow further. The same was true for the other members of the Oath Guard that had stayed behind. They were around level 66 on average now, and the dungeons in Delta that could allow them to level quickly were scarce, and many were now occupied for exclusive use by Delta. This made Evie's task one of the most important. Chapter 712 Teleportation Hub. With the departure of Alzalsar, the immortal witch had become their resident expert for space magic. It aligned with her interests, so she happily rose to the task. Planning and managing the preparation and later construction of the permanent teleportation hub in the Holy Land was now her duty. Evie was in charge of how to use the materials they had acquired from the Adventurer Guild to their best advantage. She had even officially asked for a budget to buy corresponding blueprints from the System Church. As one would expect, this kind of technology was often treated as a trade secret by the country or organization in question. It meant that it was far from cheap. 3,000 gold just to purchase the blueprints felt like daylight robbery and topped any single purchase Seth had ever done. At least they were actual blueprints and not a one-time use scroll that taught a single person how to do it. Of course, this came with other problems. It wasn't done with just getting the blueprints. Since it wasn't some magical item, she had to depend on herself to learn and understand the blueprints. This was just the start. There was a lot going on, apart from herself understanding the magic principles and corresponding skills. She needed to plan the expedition to ultimately build it. Although the materials were accounted for, they even had to keep an eye out for trustworthy masons and sculptors among the applicant to join Minas Mar, as they were also needed to ultimately build the hub from the materials. All of it was just to gain a stable connection between Minas Mar and the Holy Land. But it was worth it, as they would be able to monopolize this vast land of opportunity. It was a lot of work, but Seth never heard her complain. Evie knew the best, maybe out of all of them, that weakness was a sin in their current world. Even if people acted civilized on the surface, she had seen what people were ready to do. Only strength could keep oneself and those one cared about safe. And the Holy Land was their gateway to keep getting stronger. Seth, are you in? Seth looked up from yet another application, to see a burly adventurer leaning into the door frame of his office. It was Beamont who came for a surprise visit. Although Beamont was now his vassal, he was still having a hard time finding his place in Minas March. Yes, what is it, Beamont? I have made a decision, I have been deliberating for a while, the burly man said seriously. A decision? Seth looked up and asked. What could it be the old man wanted to tell him? You are now level 90, right? I was not sure whether I should intervene or not. I'm sure you have the qualifications, but I think you would have better results if I told you and you started preparing now. What are you talking about? Speak clearly, man. The path to becoming a legend. Seth stared at him for a long while. The path to becoming a legend, he said. The blacksmith had been wondering about the existence of legends for a long time. He had some inklings about it based on the item ranks, but it was very vague. Up to now, the system restrictions had always stopped anyone from telling him. It was a shame that it was Beamont now who offered it to him. He would have preferred to hear such detail from Alzalsar. However, something made Seth suspicious. Why did you have to deliberate about whether to tell me or not? Because it is an interference that could change your path, and I don't know if that will be a change for the better or worse. I just suspect it's for the better. So, I guess there are some requirements to enter that path, but you are sure I can step on that path? It's only that you think I would have an easier time if I knew beforehand, right? Yes. Then don't tell me. What? You heard me. But why? I made the experience that you are often more prone to ruin stuff if you think too long or serious about it. It just narrows your view and you end up concentrating on the wrong details. I think I can still do that when the time comes naturally. I see. I will still come back to you if I have any questions when that time comes. Beamont nodded with a smile. Then I will take my leave. Sorry for interrupting your work. Seth stared at the door for a while after Beamont was gone. Was he curious about what a legend was? Terribly so. But he followed his gut on this decision. He had just escaped that pressuring feeling that he needed to work hard to reach a goal. He had become a master, he had made dozens of legendary items, he reached level 90, and he had watched many of his friends become chosen or blessed. Although he couldn't say there was no pressure from declaring their independence, the blacksmith found that this was the time that he should bumble a little. He didn't have a definite goal to reach and could freely develop and explore his skills. Like the Ithilden and what things he could do with the soul refinery. The bard also wanted to visit the college again and put some work into his singing and rune mastery. The only thing that currently made progress was the processing of golems, as the golem forge automatically worked down in his workshop. Golems like the sickle strikers still needed his personal touch, but the golems currently being produced would play a big role in Myanmar's future profits. They had brought a lot of insect bodies back from the Holy Land. Many of them were actually the lower-ranked workers. This had a reason. A smithy needed materials. Currently, Myanmar was operating by purchasing a lot of the metals from outside. Less than half of the high-rated ores were mined by the tower's own drones. The problem was that there were no such mines within the reach of the magic tower. He couldn't send the drone outside the tower's reach. This was why the golem forge was now busy turning the worker insects into obedient golem drones. These bugs were born miners, even without their souls. Their bodies were born for mining and possessed mining leave 6 and mineral detection leave 2 on average. The blacksmith could send the golems wherever he wanted. This would enable them to mine the resources in the vicinity of the tree stations and along the tree route. What Seth really wanted was a mithril mine or two. With Ithilden and epic Olympian silver needing mithril as the raw material of refinement, he really needed a cheaper way to get his hands on the rare metal. But it wasn't the only thing he hoped for. If they could even find some arcane gold, they could try building more mana-gathering formations for Myanmar. As their operations grew, Myanmar also needed a good amount of mana, to create magic crystals, to power things in the tree stations, such as the barrier devices that could block portals from appearing within the cities. Although the system church was ready to supply the devices, they had to power them somehow. If they built more gathering formations, the power supply wouldn't compromise their own power supply. His thoughts kept wandering like this as he looked through the many applications and marked those he would interview personally. Some people had written long texts about their passions, and others started by announcing their ranking on the leaderboard. The latter he disqualified immediately. The leaderboards were not necessarily a reflection of skill, but more so of opportunity. Despite that, there were still tens of applications. Thinking of the time he would have to spend interviewing so many people, he really wished they could just make a tournament. Chapter 713 You do the work. Looking at the stack of paper and wishing to have less work, Seth suddenly had an idea. One that would save him a lot of time. He had read about it in some novels, he couldn't believe that he had forgotten it. In olden times, craftsmen had to produce a journeyman's piece or a masterpiece to have their skills acknowledged by their guilds. He would do exactly that. All of the applications that made it through to him were already judged as trustworthy, although some of these texts made them unsympathetic. In the end, skill should talk more than personality. This way he could quickly weed out the ones without talent. Mary, he stormed the office of Hestia's Chosen. He recoiled at the sight before him. Despite the thick black bags under her eyes, Mary's face wore a creepy smile as her hands moved at a speed that was hard to follow with normal vision. Even with Taya's vision it was still fast. The blacksmith needed a moment to understand that she wasn't just moving the papers back and forth, but actually reading and stamping or signing them. What kind of ungodly skills had she been bestowed by Hestia to support this kind of performance? What is it? She asked emotionless, without slowing her actions even once. Ah, Arim. Seth hesitate. He almost felt a little bad that he was going to add another burden for her team, just to free up some of his time. But not enough to not do it. I have a great idea for the selection of people for our production team. So? Mary sighed. The bard had no idea how she did it. It was like a disembodied sigh that just sounded in the room because none of the usual movements that should have accompanied a sigh were there. She had managed to generate a defeated sigh, without halting her movements, drooping her shoulder, or even breathing out. What do you need me to do? Her eyes literally started flickering as her eyes constantly switched between reading a new document and staring at him discouragingly. It didn't discourage him, but it sure as hell creeped him out. He brought out a stack of papers from his inventory. They were those he had already checked and those he had not checked yet. Contact these guys and tell them to send in an item that best represents their skills. The deadline should be in a week. Seth had thought about putting up some criteria like a restriction on materials or the kind of item to make, but in the end, he only decided to give a deadline. Restriction may have worked for a fair comparison of skills, but it was not necessarily fair to the applicants. A representative should be able to encompass all the abilities, skills, and resources an applicant could muster. Seth also didn't want to try and come up with a single item for every crafting class that applied. When everyone sent some item they could appraise, Seth could get the others to help judge their skills. Making the armor undergarments for the Oath Guards and Fae using celestial bronze, Nico had become a craftsman tailor in the meantime. More than enough to judge the work of other tailors. Seth trusted the eyes of Whedon and Hone enough, even though they had not yet reached the craftsman tier. Bowyer Bess and Daimon had also become journeymen while Seth had been away. The supply of good materials had helped them a lot of polish the skills of their previous lives and attain new heights. There was also Ori Abel, who was doing well learning enchantments. His judgment pertaining to jewelry could not be underestimated. For potions and stuff like that, there was obviously Allison. Evie too, but she had other things to do. With that they had an expert for almost all production classes, lessening Seth's workload once again. Fine, leave the applications on the table over there. I will have someone take care of it, Mary complied, breaking his thoughts. Great. Thanks, Mary. Jubilant Seth quickly got out of the office. With this, he had about a whole week of freedom. And what was he going to do in this week? With some time eked out from his duties, the blacksmith planned to finally explore his new class advancement. The call of the maestro allowed him to learn all production skills and primary skills. It also added the ability to appraise everything based on his own skill in the primary skill of the class. If he could learn the fundamentals for most production classes, he would be able to appraise almost every item the applicants were going to send. On the matter of appraisal, there was also Thia's discerning eyes that would greatly help him. Seth also had some items waiting on him. One was finishing Jonah's new mask. The other was a bow and mace for Lydia, especially a bow. She currently had a bow made by Bess, but performance obviously lacked compared to his Mind Reaper bow. The chosen of WebNovel, or rather her divine sugar daddy, had even provided him with special rated materials to make one of the weapons out of. A copper-colored metal bar that was called WebNovel's marrow. A bundle of white strings called WebNovel's sinew and a piece of timber called WebNovel's withered cedar. Although it was called marrow, it was definitely a metal. Seth saw no problem making a mace or club from it. It was different for the wood. Unlike Bess, Seth was no bowyer. It was rather obvious that the sinew and cedar wood were meant for the bow, but the blacksmith had no skills for woodworking or traditional bow making. His best bow was the Mind Reaper, and its power solely relied on the fact that he managed to find a very special piece of wood that had a synergy with his usage of souls. Although he could forge and reinforce the wood, non-metal bows would not gain the same improvements through his mastered skills. That was, of course, before his second class advancement. Seth intended to gain and level the carpentry skill in the following week. It was the primary skill for carpenters and other classes based on it like bowyers. He was also interested in how much the composer of fusion would help in making the bow, but first, he wanted to acquire skills. Since his office time for today had ended after shoving his idea and work back to Mary, he joyfully ran down to his workshop. His blacksmith skill allowed him to work with wood to a certain extent since he needed it to make things like shafts for pole arms or weapon handles. However, he had never acquired the carpentry skill from doing this. It just showed how hard it was to acquire a skill far outside one's class without any external help. Things were different now. With Master of all trades and his ability to work with high-rated woods, Seth could simply grab one of the epic-rated pieces of timber from the hanging tree, borrow some of Bess's tools and... Ding! You have learned carpentry, beginner, leave 1. Please check your skill window. The moment the draw knife touched the wood, he heard the system notification. He froze for a moment and blinked in surprise. It was real, he had actually gained the skill that easily. Now it was time to grow it. Chapter 714 The Grind. Ding! Your carpentry, beginner, leave 1 has become carpentry, beginner, leave 9. Botched longbow. Epic. Damage, 350. Durability, 1700. 1 plus 50% penetration. 2 plus 75% skill damage. A waste of good materials. Clearly, the work of a beginner with low accuracy, lacking durability and a high strength requirement. Nobody would want to use this bow, unless in an emergency situation. Usage requirements, 250 STR 100 dex. 6 hours later Seth finished an epic wooden bow, but it was really at the lower end of epic. As the description said, the rating was really only thanks to the material used. The additional penetration and skill damage came from the properties of the wood. The bow itself was lackluster, but maybe someone could use it as a secondary weapon. It was only thanks to his high dexterity and knowing what it was supposed to look like that it didn't fail and turned into a usable item, instead of junk. Making a bow from scratch using carpentry was really very different from forging wood as he did with the Mind Reaper bow. He had jumped up 9 levels for succeeding in making an epic bow on the first try, but it was not an item he could give anyone to use. Archers relied on dexterity, who of them would have 250 strength to use this thing? Maybe it was a good idea to bother Bess to give him some tips for the next one since he didn't have the system guidance on this one. After all, he wasn't really a carpenter or bowyer. He also couldn't rely on the support of his crafting stations. Although they had an unending supply of hanging tree wood, he might have directly ranked up to apprentice if his performance wasn't so lacking. Seth was sure he could do better with some guidance and he wasn't beneath asking someone else for help. Bess? You have a moment? The massive woman looked up from the piece she was currently planing and lifted her safety goggles. Oh, Seth. What's up? A fire started burning in her eyes after he explained to her that he was trying to learn carpentry and wanted her help. A few tips, and some guidance. He had still been stammering a little when Bess already started getting excited. Of course. Let's go. I will teach you how to make bows, she urged eagerly. She pulled him into her workshop. After he showed her his first attempt, she seemed to quickly know what to do. Bess brought out a fresh piece of wood and started by explaining the process of making a self-bow first. A self-bow was simply a wooden bow made from a branch or young tree. It was the easiest bow to make and had low maintenance, even if it wasn't made from special materials. As she explained what was important to keep in mind, she guided him through the steps. They started off with a rare-rated piece of hanging tree wood since it was what Bess had most of. She explained everything that had to be kept in mind when shaping the wood. As he learned more, he also understood how lucky he was not to have failed the first attempt. He felt like wood was a much more finicky material than metal. One had to treat every piece of wood individually. Judge the grain, the shape, and the strengths, and take care not to take away too much. The tillering had to be right, to distribute the strength correctly or it would lack durability. Oh, it's a little like tapering a blade, isn't it? He mumbled as he listened to Bess. Maybe he only felt wood was more complicated because he had already a lot of experience as a blacksmith and started off with the system's help in that area. Who knew? If he had a carpenter class, he might have found metal hard to work with. 4 hours later, with her guidance, his experience as a blacksmith, and his high dexterity, he managed to make a bow that already showed major improvement compared to his first try. Ding! Your carpentry, beginner, leave 9 has become carpentry, apprentice, leave 2. Mediocre longbow. Rare. Damage, 570. Durability, 2500. 1 plus 25% penetration. 2 plus 35% skill damage. A simple bow with good performance made from a special wood. Usage requirements, 50 STR 50 dex. The effects were weaker but the bow itself came out a lot better, despite using lower rated material. It had a higher damage and a much better durability. Seth was sure that if he added a soul, or enchanted it, it would easily get an epic rating, too. This is already a lot better. If you keep practicing like this, you will soon master how to make a self-bow. Bess praised surprised. This was the perk of already being a high-ranked crafting profession in a different discipline. Especially the high dexterity and experience made it possible to quickly rank up other crafting skills if one was able to learn them. Was what Seth liked to believe. But one could undersell the perks one had as an Orihuma. In addition, there were the effects of his trait call of the Maestro. The accompanying skills also allowed him to learn and level crafting skills easier. Thank, Bess. My carpentry also ranked up to the apprentice tier. Can you also show me how to make composite bows? In the end, Seth's goal in learning carpentry was to prepare for making Lydia's divine bow. He was given wood and sinew. Although he had little knowledge of making bows in general, he knew that those materials were usually for composited bows. Of course, he could have also just made a wooden bow with the timber alone, but he wouldn't want to risk the wrath of WebNovel. He was sure Lydia was given both materials for a good reason. A reason like composite bows being the better bow in general. Despite magical materials muddying the waters, mechanical advantages still mattered when the same materials and skills were applied. Only using WebNovel's withered cedar to make a bow would result in a less powerful bow, than making a composite bow using WebNovel's sinew. Sure. But how about we do that tomorrow? It's already very late, Bess said with a smile. Seth realized that it was already late at night. Since he had no buffs that allowed him to quicken the crafting time, making bows was very time-intensive. Sorry, I didn't want to take up so much of your time. No problem at all. Come back tomorrow and I will explain to you the ins and outs of a composite bow. It was almost 2 in the morning when he returned to the embrace of Mina, Finn, and their bed. After making up for his lateness the other day, Seth was kept in bed until noon. Shortly after he appeared in Bestwood workshop, still chewing on his breakfast. The bowyer didn't seem bothered and put aside the bow stave she was working on. At his request, she started to explain to him the fundamentals of a composite bow. A traditional composite bow is a composite of several materials that could maximize its mechanical properties. Usually, a composite bow is made from wood, horn, and sinew. Horn? Seth asked confused. Lydia had not given him any horn to use on the bow. Seth was only given wood, sinew, and metal. Yes, horn. Why do you ask? Well, it's like this. And the blacksmith explained to her why he was learning how to make bows and that he was not given any horn to use on the bow. Oh, that's why. I wouldn't worry too much about it. As I said, the point of a composite bow is to maximize the mechanical properties. Wood, horn, and sinew are just the ones usually used. Usually, you use wood for the framework, horn to store the force of compression at the belly, and sinew at the back. Whereas the belly was the side that faced toward the archer when drawing the bow and the back was the side facing away. This doesn't mean you are confined to these materials. You can also make a bow with only sinew or wood. You can also use any other materials that fulfill the same requirements to improve the power of the bow. Maybe you could also use a thin strip of the metal at the belly to store the compression force? After all, you can also make a bow from metal, no? Hearing her explanation, Seth almost had to laugh. To think that he had been the one to be hung up on the original idea of a composite bow for a moment. Sure, after hearing her explanation it seemed obvious that he didn't need to strictly follow conventions, as long as he ended up with a powerful bow. With his misunderstanding out of the way, Bess picked up the bow stave she had been working on earlier. She had actually begun to prepare a composite bow to first show him the different steps to making a recurve composite bow. Chapter 715 The Grind, 2. A normal bowyer's job was riddled with glue and strings when it came to composite bows. Fortunately, they didn't have to do that. Bess used a glue that cured quickly, but she told him that there were many different and special types of glue that had mystical effects, but needed days or even weeks to cure. It sounded like the world of bowyer's glues was similar to the acid in etching, where special acids could also have some effects on the final item. Following Bess's example, Seth finished his first basic composite bow in the way of a bowyer. They needed less of the rare wood but used the uncommon sinew, and horn of an impaler antelope, a dungeon monster found in many rift dungeons. Ding! Your carpentry, apprentice, leave 2 has become carpentry, apprentice, leave 4. Rough impaler bow. Rare. Damage, 650. Durability, 2200. 1 plus 35% penetration. 2 plus 35% skill damage. 3 plus 15 agility. A simple composite bow with good performance made from a special wood and monster materials. Usage requirements, 50 STR 50 dex. The resulting composite bow had slightly improved the damage and effects while keeping the same requirements. The biggest advantage was probably that it was smaller and felt easier to use. In exchange, took more work and was a little less durable than the mediocre longbow. The bow looked a little weird like AC when unstrung, but looked like a proper bow when strung. Making it that way felt counterintuitive, but Bess said this was normal and needed for a recurve bow. Seth made another one under Bess's supervision, bringing his carpentry to level 6 of the apprentice tier before they called it a day. For the next 2 days, the bowyer showed him how to make different kinds of bows that employed different aspects he had already experienced when making the composite bows. She showed him flat bows, similar to the self-bow he had made at first. But also laminated bows, which used different layers of wood with the same intention as a composite bow. There were also sinew-backed bows, that used only sinew, instead of sinew and horn. This was another option for Lydia's bow. On the last day they had started using epic materials, and the results helped him overcome the last level of the apprentice tier and reach carpentry, adept, leave 1. Although the blacksmith would have wanted to keep training his carpentry like this, at least until he reached journeyman, he currently didn't have the time to do so. The day after the blacksmith had bothered her about his idea, Mary had informed him that someone had taken care of his message. This meant he had already used 3 of the 7 days to get carpentry to the adept tier. He judged that adept had to suffice since there was another skill he wanted to get a basic mastery of before they started grading the applicant's sample pieces. And he would probably all the time he could get for that one. Besides sewing, which was already at the adept tier, he wanted to learn alchemy so he could also have a look at potions and such the applicant might submit. This meant the next person he was going to bother was Allison. When he entered the laboratories the next day, he found her door locked, so he knocked. "Allison. I heard what you did. Go next door, I prepared stuff for you. Now go away," she barked lethargically. Baffled, he scratched his head. He could only shrug and take a look at the room next door. Allison was always like that, so he didn't take it personally. In the lab next door he found a recipe and a bunch of ingredients arranged on the table. There were herbs, beeswax, powders. Seth picked up the recipe to read. A healing salve, he wondered, puzzled. Was this considered alchemy? Well, here goes nothing. He shrugged and started following the recipe. Seth understood why he had to start from the very bottom. Unlike in carpentry, he didn't have any skill that allowed him to handle high-rated alchemy ingredients. Following the recipe, he started sorting the ingredients. In this instance, Thia's discerning eyes helped him easily identify the herbs and ingredients on the table. He started measuring the ingredients and got the Bunsen burner-like flame burning, to mix everything in a small pot. It was important to keep the mix cooking at a specific even temperature. Surprisingly, his pyrokinesis came into play and allowed him to easily keep the heat constant. After the time specified in the recipe, he started pouring it into prepared, small pots with lids. These could be sold and taken along on a journey. Once the salve cooled down, Seth really got the message. Ding! You have learned alchemy, beginner, leave 1. Please check your skill window. He had really managed to gain the skill by simply making a few pots of healing salves. With this, the ability to appraise products of alchemy was also added to his blacksmith's eyes according to the skills that came with Call of the Maestro. Eagerly, he tried to test it. Healing salve. Common. 1 plus 5% regeneration of superficial wounds. 2 25% less scarring. A well-made simple healing salve anyone could make. To be applied on superficial wounds only. Not bad for the first try, he thought to himself. They were more of a simple salve for the medicine cabinet at home, rather than some magical potion, but it had worked in giving him the alchemy skill. Allison, he knocked on the door again. Go to the next lab 1 door over and stop bothering me. The tired voice answered through the door. Bewildered, Seth stepped back. How much had she prepared for this? He had not even informed her beforehand, he could only smile, thinking Allison was actually more diligent than she let others know. In the next lab, he found the recipe for a beginner stamina potion and a whole lot of common materials. There were a lot more sets of ingredients for the potion. He had told the others about his job advancement and the perks, but had Allison already expected that the pots of salves would be enough for him to acquire the skill and prepare this recipe so he could train the beginner tier? Compared to the salve, the potion was already more of a chemistry experiment. It involved processing the medical plants, distilling, and to measure, mixing, and cooking the resulting liquids to finish the potion. Despite not benefiting a lot from his original crafting skills when performing alchemy, his pyrokinesis got a chance to shine, since he was able to minutely control the temperatures of the liquids, which was one of the most important aspects for the reactions to occur. Beginner Stamina Potion. Common. 1 regenerates 10% stamina over 30 minutes. An easy-to-make stamina potion, slightly better than simply taking a rest for half an hour. Each set of ingredients resulted in 5 potion bottles and he made about 20% proficiency per set on beginner level 1. There was only one advantage to note, which was that he could process several sets simultaneously. His high dexterity made processing the herbs easily, while pyrokinesis allowed him to control the fires of several alchemy stations at once on the side. Although it was still much slower than his cheat when leveling carpentry, Seth managed to raise his alchemy to level 3. It was a shame his awesome proficiency buff was not working for anything that was not part of his class. It worked for any skill a blacksmith or goldsmith could have because he had ranks in those on the leaderboards, but not carpentry, or alchemy. At this point, he only got less than 5% per set, but it was also already late, so Seth did not return to bother Allison about the next recipe. The 16 sets he processed resulted in almost 80 successful potion bottles of beginner stamina potion. It wasn't really worth much and was often sold like an energy drink, instead of something worthy to be called a potion. He simply left the bottles standing in the lab and returned to his quarters, to spend the evening with Mina and Finn. What the heck? He just got the skill and processed almost all the ingredients I prepared. Allison looked at the heap of potions Seth had left behind in the laboratory. It seemed like she underestimated Seth a little. She would have to prepare more for tomorrow. What a pain. Chapter 716 The Grind, 3. Thanks to Allison's preparation, Seth experienced a smooth and engaging entry into alchemy, which mostly consisted of making oodles and noodles of increasingly difficult potions for beginners. 2 days later, Seth finally broke through to the apprentice tier. Alchemy was obviously harder to level for him than carpentry since there were no real shortcuts. He had some cheats, but no real shortcuts. If there was one major thing that he learned about alchemy in these 3 days, then it was that it wasn't for him. The blacksmith felt that wood was a little finicky, but it wasn't bad once he got used to it. Alchemy on the other hand became increasingly complex, despite all potions still just using common materials. Don't worry, it will get easier later on. The problem was that you were still a beginner, so you could only use common ingredients. In favor of keeping the proficiency gain high, the potions had to be more complicated, Allison explained when he finally got a hold of her and complained. Her explanation actually made sense and calmed the discouraged blacksmith. It was fun making the initial stamina potion, but the later potions she had prepared for him became really stressful to make. On the other hand, the really complicated potions were uncommon potions that used common ingredients, like a basic health potion. It needed a complicated process and many different ingredients, but it was an uncommon potion he was able to make. This allowed him to finally pass through the beginner tier. Don't be relieved, yet. When you start working with uncommon ingredients, the crafting process might become easier, but it will become harder to actually succeed in brewing the potion. Since plants will always have tiny individual differences, you will need to take great care when it comes to the synergy of materials. More so, since their effect will be more magical and the ingredients are more expensive, she warned. Right, Seth knew that raising an alchemist was a money sink. Growing as a blacksmith wasn't cheap either, but there was a major difference. It was a lot harder to ruin a magical metal than a magic herb. If a blacksmith failed to make an item, it would not magically disappear. In general, he could still recycle the material and try again. If an alchemist messed up, the materials used were lost in 99% of the cases. Since alchemy was like magic, chemistry, and biology intertwined, the transformative processes the materials went through could not be reverted. Simply said, if the alchemist messed up, all the expensive materials he used became trash. This was why raising an alchemist was a money sink, as the initial success rate for potions was really low. Personally, he really benefited from his good dexterity, skills, and experience. Even during the more complicated processes, Seth's failure rate was only 20%, unlike a real beginner who would usually have a success rate of 20% at best. He denied that the call of the maestro trait had a lot to do with it. Seth was convinced that it was easier for a craftsman to diversify after already mastering a craft or two. Also, that is only if you do it the normal way. Since you want to reach adept by the day after tomorrow, things won't become easier for you. Seth gulped and his face turned pale. Why are you looking like that? You didn't think it would be that easy to reach the adept tier in 4 days, right? I used the last 3 days to prepare you. Tomorrow you will start using uncommon ingredients to make rare potions. Hearing her say it like this, Seth couldn't help but doubt whether he could do this. Did he even have to do this? He could just leave grading the potions to Allison, right? No, he wouldn't back down from the challenge. If he failed, then he failed. But if Allison thought he had a chance, then he had to try. Fine, let's do this. It's already late. So of course we continue tomorrow. Allison reminded him of the daytime. Oh, right. Yes, let's do it tomorrow, then he belatedly agreed with her. This had taken some of the wind out of his sails, but he still looked forward to tomorrow. He would do his best, and if he failed to become an adept, that was okay. It just meant he didn't have enough time, not that he didn't try. Paolo. We finally did it. Marco came running back into their rundown flat, screaming joyfully. What are you screaming about like a lunatic so early in the morning? Paolo asked tiredly. One of his eyes cracked open and he looked at the excited swordsman and oldest childhood friend. Our applications were accepted. We can join Minasmar and move to Tree Station 1. WH what? What are you talking about? Our application? Paolo asked in shock. It had been months since they tried to enter the Oath Guard but ultimately did not manage to. It wasn't the only setback. In general, their lives had taken a downward turn after their tanker got involved with drugs and attacked their mage. At one point, they had tried really hard to gain strength as a group and join the Oath Guard, but after the incident, they lost their tanker and their mage quit, too. They had a hard time forming a new party, so their levels stagnated. Still, the healer and the swordsman had kept pushing on. That was until Delta suddenly started disbanding guilds and drafting people. Paolo, who had always been the optimist of the two, had suddenly lost his drive when he heard that Minas Mar was officially disbanded. They had managed to avoid the government's draft, but their finances didn't look good. Most dungeons had become exclusive for Delta's personnel. Not only did their level stagnate, but they also had a hard time just making the money for food and rent. The curfew further isolated them from people they knew. They had to get into the dungeons during the day, and by the time they got out they had to hurry back to their cheap flat if they didn't want to be apprehended for being outside past the curfew. Facing the harsh reality, the healer became depressed and left their tiny flat less and less often. Even when they made their fulminant return, Paolo could not get himself off the bed. He was stuck in his state of mind, and his friend didn't know what to do. But he also didn't have the time. Marco became the driving force that kept the two from living on the streets. Without Paolo, Marco had to join random parties, which reduced their earnings even more. He had thought of abandoning Paolo more than once, but they were friends. It meant they had to go through thick and thin. When he heard the announcement of Minas Mar, he saw this as a chance to get them both back on track. Didn't you hear about it? Minas Mar's declaration of independence and their recruitment of more people? I put in an application for the both of us. It says we were not simply accepted, but we were offered to join the Oath Guard at the recommendation of members from the official field teams. Marco explained excitedly, waving around 2 letters. Finally, Paolo sat up and looked Marco straight in the eyes. His gaze was conflicted. The healer was struggling with his own feeling. Anger at Marco, who simply did something without his knowledge, and happiness to hear that Minas Mar was not just back, but they were even invited with a recommendation. But most of all, he struggled with himself. Paolo had been in a slump for weeks and it wasn't that easy to leave that state of mind behind. Yet, he was trying his best just to keep a slight smile on his face without crying. I'm glad, he finally pressed out, prompting a smile from Marco with visible relief. The swordsman had been worried about his friend, but he didn't know how to help him. It wasn't like there were many places left that offered therapy, not to mention whether Paolo wanted that, or them even being able to pay for that. Seeing the young man smile, just a little, lifted a big burden from his heart. Maybe they could back to the time when they both looked into the future with hope. Chapter 717. Somewhere else, 19. Somewhere in the central mountain range close to Mount Agra. He really wasn't made for this kind of journey. Cormac Pale, the chosen of Hephaestus, really regretted not putting more effort into leveling up and fighting. He was never an athlete and enjoyed staying in his workshop a lot more, even before the apocalypse. As a mechanical engineer and subsequently gaining a higher blacksmith class, he always enjoyed the privilege to stay at the base and using materials that the agency's hunters brought him. Even with the world going to shit and the war against the fish people, he never actively joined the battle. Now he regretted his hesitation. The harsh weather alone was already a hard burden to his weak body. Even though he had the golems made in accordance to divine blueprints, their materials were not the best and the monsters they came across in the mountains were more than just a little frightening. After a handful of fights, the golden bull already looked worse for the wear and needed urgent repairs. Flying on the back of the bronze eagle was no solution either, because of the many flying beasts that had found their home here. Cormac had gained a few levels thanks to the initial fights, but he quickly learned his lesson from the near-death experiences. Following his almost loss of the golden bull in a fight where the eagle and the bull had to work together to defeat something that looked like a giant olm, he started avoiding monsters as best as he could. Stumbling through a heavy snowfall, he managed to find a dry spot under an overhang. Really, his only saving grace was that he at least tried to prepare for this journey. He had enough rations and had even managed to purchase a map skill book without Epsilon's leadership noticing. Thanks to the skill, he at least knew where he was and he knew the rough location of Mount Agra, his first goal. Reaching this little shelter, his knees weakened and he plopped to the ground. He needed a break to collect his thoughts and repair the bull. In preparation for his escape, he had also made a portable forge and anvil that enabled him to work along the way. His heart ached, seeing the bull in its current state. Many of the armor plates that covered the mechanical body to create a smooth surface were bent out of shape, broken, or even missing. The parts beneath had also taken quite the hit. At least the core was not damaged. Warming his body in the blaze of the forge, his thought finally calmed a little. After the repair of the bull, Cormac brought out the leather of the Olm. He had not been able to prepare materials for the journey, and the Olm was the first beast that was left with enough materials for a cloak after he used loot on it. The blacksmith had underestimated how hard it would be to get his hands on materials on his own. Without a professional hunter, just looting a corpse was a huge waste of materials. He quickly got to work, as there was no worth in regretting the loss. He had put some effort in his sewing as part of his blacksmith work, yet the result of his work with leather still was not pretty. It was a cloak mottled with grey and white patches. It had uneven sides and a crooked hood. As ugly as it was at least functional, giving him enough cold resistance to stop freezing and even some amount of camouflage in the snowy landscape. He had no stealth skills, so being able to hide from monsters and avoid fights with the help of the cloak was a great help to him. Since both, the eagle and the bull, were too flashy in this environment, he opted to keep going on foot for now. A pet? A mount? He had always only worked on items and spent the pay he got for it from the association on more materials for his private work. He never had the chance to tame or buy a pet or mount, so all he could do was trudge through the snow with his own feet, once he left his little shelter. At least he had a strong body. As a blacksmith and being the chosen of Hephaestus, his strength, dexterity, and endurance were boosted, giving him a good stamina. His hands covered in thick calluses also had no problems with climbing the sharp, rocky cliff and mountains in his way once the cold was less of a problem. Since the first part of his journey happened on the back of the eagle, he was far off any trodden paths. Finding an old road, a path, or anything that could ease his travel became a priority, only second to advancing forward. He was only able to navigate thanks to map and his knowledge of the estimated location of Mount Agra, otherwise, he would have been absolutely lost. Funny enough, the most nerve-wracking moments were not when was curled up into a ball, watching some outlandish and terrifying beast pass by, hoping it wouldn't find him. It was every time he couldn't find a way around and had to climb the steep cliffs that barred his way. His palms were sweaty, his knees weak and his arms heavy. His neck was cramping as he continuously looked up, or else he feared to empty the humble contents of his stomach onto his sweater. If a monster saw him, he could still try to fight. If he fell, it was over. Cormac was climbing such a cliff and almost had a heart attack, when his hand grabbing the highest ledge slipped and his head turned, looking beneath him. He stared into the depths and was struck with fear for a moment. But this wasn't how he would die, he didn't accept this. Out of pure defiance, he swung around, grabbed the ledge with all his strength, and pulled himself up in one move. His resolve was immediately rewarded and his heart jumped in joy. He stood on a ridge that led down to a small valley. Everything was covered in snow, but he could clearly see the signs of civilization. At the bottom of the small valley was a street, or at least one that existed here decades ago. The important thing was that it was an even path leading through the mountains. Laughing happily, he started sliding down the small ridge down into the valley. Reaching the bottom, he found that it was really a street. At one point it might even have been asphalted, but now it was just a gravelled road. He couldn't see any obvious sign of recent use, so he couldn't tell if this was part of the routes merchants travelled to Mount Agra. This didn't mean that it wasn't. Cormac wasn't a scout or pathfinder and everything was covered in snow. There may have been traces he just didn't notice. However, it led in roughly the right direction he remembered, so he decided to travel along this road. Even if he met beasts here, he would rather fight another Olm than climb another cliff after almost falling just now. He traveled along the road for a few days. He did encounter more beasts and had to hide, but he was still a lot faster on the road when compared to off-roading. He also found a few places with old campfires that indicated that this road was used at least a few times in the last months. He even found a portable defensive barrier in one of these places. It was broken, but Cormac was sure he could repair it. The reason why it was broken and left behind was rather tragic, but the blacksmith did his best not to think about what he had seen that day. This barrier was a cheap product, in Cormac's opinion, that was made up of engraved pieces of dwarven copper linked to a chain that created the formation if laid on the ground. It had a weak defensive barrier and a slight stealth function that would allow the camp to stay hidden. With the material of this chain barrier, the blacksmith was able to make a new one and strengthen its overall effects. There may have been other useful things, but he didn't dare to linger in that place of death. He was getting close to the estimated location of Mount Agra when the mountains were suddenly covered in a thick carpet of fog. Cormac could barely see a few meters ahead of himself. This was no situation to stay out in the open, so he started crouching along the edge of the road, looking for a place to hide. The blacksmith squeezed into a small crevasse beside an alleviated ledge above the road. He had been lying there for half an hour, tightly wrapped in his cloak, when he heard something. It was the echo of many, many, rhythmic steps that came down along the road he had just been on. Chapter 718 Eyes of the Maestro. Ding! Your alchemy, apprentice, leave 9 has become alchemy, adept, leave 1. Finally, Seth was able to collapse. Relieved, he sank to the ground, looking like a mess. The white lab coat he borrowed was stained by residues of chemicals, herb juices, powders, and burns for literal explosions, but he did it. In a secure cabinet in a faraway corner, sat several tens of bottles of rare medium health potion, arduously synthesized from only uncommon and common materials. He had just finished the last set of ingredients and grossed the 9th level of the apprentice tier. Ding! You have fulfilled a special condition. You have gained basic mastery or more for more than 5 basic crafting skills. Your skill blacksmith size is evolving in conjunction with your trait calling of the maestro. Ding! You have gained the skill Eyes of the Maestro. Congratulations! He had only a moment to take a breather before the system suddenly dropped a notification on him. Basic mastery, did it mean the adept tier? What happened to his skill? Seth wondered as he opened the skill window to check what that meant. His blacksmith's eyes had vanished. The skill had already slightly changed before, because of his new trait and the accompanying skills which allowed him to appraise materials and items of other classes as long as he mastered the corresponding skill, but now the skill had evolved. Instead of blacksmith's eyes leave 7 now stood Eyes of the Maestro leave 7. Checking the skill, he found that little had changed, except for a small but powerful detail. His blacksmith's eyes were not only able to appraise. The skill had also been able to deduct the blueprints of the items checked and even allowed him to learn the used enchantment under certain conditions. At the start he still had to disassemble the times, but later he only had to do that with anything above epic. Of course, this only concerned the items that coincided with his class like weapons, armor, and jewelry. Now, however, it counted for every item he could theoretically make with his own crafting skills. This was crazy. He could gain the blueprint for rare and below bows, the sewing pattern for clothes, and the recipe for potions, just by appraising them, as long as they were rare rated or below, since rare was the tier that correlated to the adept tier in skills. Especially since he would be able to use the system guidance, once he had the blueprints, or recipes registered. Although Seth had no great interest in being a potion crafter, he was interested in experimenting to make his own acids for etching. It was no different for other classes like tailor, carpenter, or even bard. He welcomed the passive perks these skills brought him, but he didn't feel like straying too far from his original path. Seth was a blacksmith by the end of the day and intended to stay one. Tired, he closed his skill window. It was almost early morning already. Tower, to my quarters, he instructed the tower ego and teleport to the tower master's quarters. There he found Mina and Finn sleeping together on the couch, in the middle of a battlefield of empty ice cream tubs and the TV still running. After taking a shower and changing clothes, he carefully brought the 2 victims of the food coma to bed, before falling asleep himself. Neil had worked hard for today. He had been insecure about his application at Minasmar since he was unsure whether he really had the skill to be chosen. He was ranked 146 on the leaderboard for blacksmiths, which was neither high nor low. He also had no special class, he was just a simple blacksmith. After the apocalypse, his first class had actually been miner, before he changed his class and started to make items. He had been one of the very first and had experienced their struggle with the demon and the volcano in the beginning. At the start, he was to raise his skills a little quicker since the miner skills allowed him to work with uncommon materials he had managed to procure from the outside with said mining skills. The items he had made back then were not great, since it was a beginner fumbling around with uncommon materials, but they were enough for the time. Later on, his goals changed. Delta severely lacked items for adventurers back then, even the most basic one could have saved a life. Instead of pursuing the improvement of his skills, he had focused on making as many items as possible using common materials like steel. He was sure that his decision had helped many, but in the end, it didn't really help him. Other blacksmiths popped up and the merchants from Krina, the supply of common items were more than enough, but at that point, he was already stuck. Neil wasn't the best blacksmith in Delta by far, but his shop was going okay and it had some loyal customers, but he could see it in their eyes and in the eyes of new customers. His products couldn't help anyone anymore. Even when he made the best steel sword there were, they would fall behind a casual item made with a similar skill level and uncommon items. At the same time, his blacksmith skill was stuck at apprentice level 9, since he got almost no proficiency for common weapons. Yet, he couldn't just leave and try to mine for materials himself like he did in the beginning. He also didn't have the money to buy better materials on the current market. He was well and truly stuck. To make matters worse, someday 5 weeks ago a bunch of suits simply put a pair of guards at the door of his shop and told him that his merchandise was confiscated for the sake of Delta, or whatever. This had been the last stab his heart could take. His stock of steel stayed untouched, as his workshop became abandoned. What was the sense of still making items? His skill didn't grow, his items were not wanted, and he couldn't even sell them cheaply to whatever aspiring adventurer in dire need would take them. Until he heard the recruitment offers of Minas Mar, he just sat at home and watched his meager saving dwindle, deliberating whether he should simply change his class again. When he heard that Minas Mar opened their door to recruit, he decided to stake this decision on this last chance. When he then heard that he was allowed to participate in a practical round that included making a piece that was representative of their skills, his passion was reignited. How would he have known? This chance may have been given mostly because Seth was too lazy to look through all applications seriously. The deadline of 7 days was a tight constraint, but Neil was not deterred. Since he was given the chance, he started to pour all his skill and passion into his work. He didn't have the money to even buy even the most basic uncommon material, nor a high rank on the leaderboard. All he could do is to try and win the judged over with his display of skill. Although he had only been working with steel for the past year and something, he was confident to have perfected his craft at least in this aspect. Since he couldn't afford other materials, he had put a lot of effort into learning all the details of steel their modern society could offer him. He mastered everything from forging, shaping, and balancing the weapon, to the right heat treatment. He even experimented with smelting and making his own alloys. The item was supposed to be representative and few things showed a blacksmith's skill as well as a good sword. It was a long sword, and the shape was as traditional and functional as it could get, but Neil decided to be a little fancy and use pattern welded steel to make it stand out. He used a bar of twisted layered steel for the center, while the edge was made up of patterned crucible steel he had managed to make himself during his experiments. The result was an uncommon dark grey longsword, with almost black, symmetrical patterns in the center. I looked gorgeous and deadly if he said so himself. By the time he finished, it was already the day he had to submit it, so he only fashioned a simple sheath for it. Still wearing his apron and covered in soot all over, the blacksmith quickly ran to the business building of Minas Mar to submit his work. Chapter 719 Sample Pieces. By the time Neil arrived at the embassy, it was already noon. He was tired, sweaty, and gasping for air, but he made it in time. Is that Neil Repmar? Neil, what are you doing here? Don't tell me, are also trying to join Minas Mar, a blacksmith standing in the lobby asked. His name was Liam and he was once his junior, but he had been lucky enough to become an arcane blacksmith. A rare class that allowed him to quickly learn and even develop enchantments. Being able to imbue magic into weapons allowed him to quickly grow past Neil. With his growing skill, his rank on the leaderboard rose, and together with his fancy style of items he gained a lot of popularity. At some point, he had started looking down on Neil and his simple, more traditional style of items without any enchantments or good materials. I have been invited, so I would obviously have to give it a try, the blacksmith answered solemnly. Are you going to submit that? The other asked, pointing at the sword in the hastily made leather sheath. Yep, he answered undeterred, and went to the counter to register himself and submit his sword. Ha! Do you really think they will accept you with that kind of item? You didn't even bother to make a cool sheath, another scoffed before Liam could say anything. Neil looked at the staff member bringing away his sword. He had no answer or counter to his criticism, as he only voiced Neil's own thoughts. The blacksmith had already been close to giving up on his profession, what right did he have to defend himself? Oh, this one looks great. Look at the craftsmanship, he heard one of the dwarfs. The gold inlays are really well done. Is that arcane gold? Ori commented. Show me. You are right, it's not easy to work dark steel that cleanly, Whedon gave his expertise. Seth had slightly overslept when he came up to the judging room. Mary had prepared it in one of the many great halls within their business building. It was a room filled with tables and stands where the items were put on displays for them to judge, divided by the classes that submitted them. For safety reasons, and out of respect for the craftsmen, the items they put 7 days of work into would not leave the building. However, the craftsmen were not present while the judges were doing their work. They could either leave or wait in a separate hall prepared for them, with snacks and drinks. Seth walked in on the smiths, standing around a fancy glaive called the dragon glaive. The glaive was a polearm resembling a wide saber put, usually with a spike or hook in the back, at the end of a pole. This specific one had an almost black blade, with the dragon's head modeled at the connection with the pole. Golden inlays made it look as if the blade was black flames the dragon was spitting. Seth immediately recognized that arcane gold was used to add a weak permanent enchantment. Strength, if he was not wrong. The golden inlays had the advantage that the wielder could also inject his own magic to further strengthen his power. It was a well-executed concept and made with good craftsmanship. Skill-wise there was nothing to complain about. The only thing he didn't like was the design choices. Seth liked functionality, but he also liked to think that he was not against decorating something that was already functional. However, in this case, the maker had used a lot of material to model the dragon head, making the blade of the glaive unnecessarily heavy. In a world where people were many times stronger than the average human, it was not necessarily a problem. Even if one took the leverage of that weight at the end of the long pole into account. He was sure there would be those who would buy it for the coolness factor, but it was a waste of good materials, in the blacksmith's eyes. Why use a rare material to make these kinds of decorations? An engraving would have been enough, or making it from ordinary steel since it was only supposed to look good. Adding it to the glaive, instead of using it to make another dagger or short sword from it, was decadence. If they really brought this guy in, they would have to cut that back. On the other hand, this kind of person would probably also do well on their own. They even mastered basic enchantments. Seth knew there were customers for these kinds of designs. It wouldn't be too bad to send them to one of the tree stations and fend for themselves. After a moment of thought, Seth came over and filled out the piece of paper hanging on the weapon. The maker would be given certain benefits. He was free to choose a tree station and get a reduced rent for the place of his choice. He would not join Mina's march. The 3 that had been marveling at the glaive looked at him in shock, when they saw what he wrote, but they didn't argue with him. Seth was the only master among them, after all. While the craftsmen were appreciating the works of fellow craftsmen, Allison, Nico, and the others were judging the items within their own expertise and writing down their recommendations. Although Seth's focus was drawn by the weapons, armor, and jewelry, it was hard to argue that they were the most eye-catching. There were tables full of potions and other alchemy products in fancy flasks. There were mannequins with clothes, garbs, and brilliantly embroidered gowns. There was even a table with several scrolls enchanted with instant spells and some small trinkets, submitted by enchanters. This last table especially was of great interest for Mina's Mar, as they truly lacked someone specialized in arcane enchantments. Despite their efforts, Mary had been unable to recruit someone until now. There was Alzalsar, but he couldn't ask the sorceress to enchant uncommon rings and stuff like that, right? An enchanter could further refine their lower-end merchandise and make use of materials they usually sold, and once they grew they would become a great asset. Everyone agreed to save the enchanters for last since the scrolls were consumables. They could only be used once, so they waited on testing them and the trinkets, so everyone to judge their use and effects later on. They also made the sensible decision to have someone inform the enchanters about it since it would become late until they got their results. Seth beelined towards the alchemy tables and started collecting new recipes. However, not all of them were any good. One had to question the sanity of some of these. There were normal potions to buff oneself like speed potions, strength potions, and such. Others helped recover resources like health, stamina, or mana. There were also various antidotes and poisons to apply or prevent status ailments. And then there were the odd ones. Like Jeremiah's disclothment potion, which resulted in the immediate removal of all clothes on the target. It only worked on simple clothes, not armor or magic items. Or the Tonibler's tonic, which allowed for the detection of any toes ready for consumption within a 50m radius. That was what the description said, and it left more questions than it gave answers. Like, who needed this? What were toes ready for consumption? The worst ones were those that resulted in a temporary bodily change, such as spider concoction. A potion that would temporarily grow a proboscis from a person's butt and allowed them to generate spider silk. Another one allowed growing a limb, like a third arm, to wield another weapon. The others were questionable, but these ones were deeply disconcerting. There were quite a few potions like this, and obviously he now also had their recipes in his recipe catalog. Maybe it was better not to get any more alchemists than needed. It seemed like this class was especially prone to creating lunatics. Seeing Allison judging these with a serious face and not even a twitch at the outlandish effects, made the blacksmith doubt her sanity, too. After witnessing the depth of potion making, Seth was glad they made a separate method for judging the chefs that had applied. Link had insisted that he wanted to see them work, and not just the final result. That was why Link had been busy over the past 7 days, visiting all the chosen applicants in their restaurants, or inviting them to the Turquoise Anvil to cook there together. Although it robbed him of the chance to taste a bunch of tasty foods, Seth had agreed that this was the best method. On a brighter note, when he came to the colorful garbs and gowns submitted by tailors, he found that there were actually some tailors that had mastered the skill to imbue magic effects into clothes through weaving techniques and embroidery. They were not overwhelmingly, since there were not as many materials that would lend themselves to be turned into magic fabric, or thread. The most extravagant of them was probably a button-up embroidered with thread made from rare arcane gold. This worked in a similar fashion to the inlays made of the same material. The embroidery formed a magic circuit, while the materials could naturally absorb and store mana to power it. Walking around the hall really opened Seth's eyes in one way or the other. Chapter 720 Indomitable Blacksmith. Some people really know no shame. Right, right. He barely has the money to buy steel. I bet he's been home and drinking ever since his shop got closed. You should have seen the faces of those rubes that kept buying his stuff out of gratitude. You mean their veneration when they first hold something made from something like dark iron. Right, right. Isn't it hilarious? Neil kept a blank expression, but his ears were almost steaming from listening to people gossip about him. He definitely didn't lack confidence in his skills, but their comments really bit into his ego. Suddenly, someone sat down beside him. Listen, Neil. I'm only telling you because I care. Don't you think you are in the wrong place? They invited me, so. It's not what I meant. Look around you. I know you are a great blacksmith, but, you probably spent your whole time on a steel sword and then threw a shabby sheath together, right? You know why they are looking down on you, right? Do you think a steel sword could measure up to anything they put their heart and soul into? Right, Repmar? You should listen to your friend. Even if they invite you to travel to the tree stations, do you really think you will be of help to anyone when your focus lied on steel swords? Even if you open a new store, without the guys buying your stuff out of gratitude, how will you sustain yourself? Neil was about to puke. Liam was one thing, he knew the young man spoke out of some misguided care, but the others were plainly mocking him, trying to sound like they cared. It was just a minority openly talking like this, maybe 4 or 5, some more judging him silently, but nobody tried to stop them. They silently agreed or didn't care. His fist balled up, but he couldn't say anything. He had chosen his path to help others, but it seemed like he had missed his exit. He knew that his situation might have been hopeless. He knew it may have been a better idea to go for a different class. But he couldn't help but cling to this single chance. He didn't want to give up being a blacksmith. Yo, who of you made this? A rude young man in his mid-20s had appeared in the waiting room holding up a sword in a shabby sheath. Haha, are they going to ask him to leave right away? Someone exclaimed. Wait, isn't that the Tower Master? Why would the Tower Master come to throw someone out? Neil hesitatingly lifted his arm. It really was the Tower Master. What was he going to do with him? Had his sword offended him enough to come out and ridicule him personally? You made this? The Tower Master asked seriously. Why yes, this is my sword. What is your current skill level? I am stuck at apprentice level 9, Neil admitted honestly. With an ordinary blacksmith class, he questioned further. All right, follow me, the Tower Master ordered succinctly. What for? Didn't you apply to join Minas Mar? Of course, we are going to have a personal interview. Earlier, the potions had caused him some mental damage, but he had mostly recovered by the time he returned to the sections with weapons and armor. The dwarfs and Ori were still busy with their preliminary judgments. Seth trusted his friends, and he was only going to check on the ones they recommended later on. Instead, he concentrated on the new items that were still pouring in. What fell into his eyes was a rare sight among the entries. A haphazardly glued together sheath. When his eyes stopped at it, he found that the crappy sheath stood in stark contrast to the expertly crafted and polished handle. A crossbar and pommel made from pattern-welded steel and dark brown wood for the handle that gave a warm and inviting contrast to the dark metal surrounding it. The blacksmith knew the reason for the lackluster sheath the moment he grabbed the hilt. Someone had given it their all to make this sword. He unsheathed it and almost flung the unworthy sheath away. The weapon felt light in his hand, so well balanced that Seth was unsure whether he could do it better. It was a great blade that made him want to swing it. Aesthetically, it also convinced with the expertly forged pattern-welded steel. This person had even managed to create an uncommon weapon from common materials. Seth knew a blueprint that could accomplish the same, but he could tell that this sword went a step further. The blade's edges were made from a special steel. It was still common steel since it held no magic or element, but in conjunction with the overwhelming technique that went into it, it gave this weapon an uncommon rating. Unlike Seth, this was a craftsman who had spent a lot of time studying the ins and outs of steel and overcame its initial rating by bringing it to its very limits. He had been standing there for a while when he heard a whistle from the back. Hone had come over, his eyes glued to the sword, just like Seth's. Was this made by a purist? What do you mean? No enchantments, not engravings, no special skills. Looks like the work of a purist. Those kinds of people are rare. It's an arduous path to take, but if they make it. What? If they make it, they would be the favorite of any enchanter, since they make items that purely rely on the skill of the craftsman and the power of the material. It is a lot easier for a magician to enchant them with their spells. You know, since there won't be any other magic interfering. Is it a special class? I can also just leave out any enchantments. Well, yes and no. Unless they reach journeyman this way, they stay an ordinary common blacksmith. Once they do, they can rank up to an indomitable blacksmith that specializes in exploring the limits of a material and bringing out its absolute maximum. That class also majorly improves items that only rely on the materials. The base stats of these items will be a lot higher than ordinarily. In my world, it was mostly humans that managed to earn this class, mostly because they had no talent for magic, so they explored the limits of the materials instead, the dwarf explained. Interesting. Taking into account that they would have enchanters joining their ranks soon, Seth made a quick decision. Current. Everyone stared at Neil's back as he followed the tower master to a meeting room. He still had a hard time grasping what was going on, before he had a warm cup of tea in his hand and listened to the tower master, Seth, explaining why he was invited up. So, are you willing to stay with Minasmar and become an indomitable blacksmith? Neil stared at him as he processed what he had just heard. While he had been doubting his path and was at the cusp of giving up, suddenly a master blacksmith appeared before him and told him not to give up. He knew it would be hard work. He knew it would be a long way, but hearing that he could gain a special, coveted, class as long as he persevered until he reached the journeyman tier sparked new hope inside his heart. Seth mentioned that Minasmar would completely support him with knowledge and materials as long as he signed the contract and joined them. He would no longer have to worry about the material costs or the way to treat an uncommon material. It sounded like paradise. What question is that? Of course, I want to. With that, Neil Repmar was the first blacksmith, also the first craftsman, to join Minasmar after their declaration of independence.